Okay, good morning, everyone. A special greeting to our leadership, HODs, Chairperson of the Innovation Hub Board, speakers, industry stakeholders, cannabis growers, processors, traders, officials, activists, and all delegates. Welcome to the Gauteng Provincial Government Cannabis webinar that is held under the theme of unlocking Gauteng cannabis through investment and financing. The webinar is brought to you by a team from the Department of Agriculture and Rural Development, the Provincial Department of Economic Development, as well as the Gauteng Growth and Development Agency, all under the leadership of MEC Tau. My name is Mutlacho Makaipea and I work for GDAT. I'm responsible for the Chief Directorate of Agro-Processing and Economic Services. I will be facilitating the first part of the program that has got 5 presentations. And May Mudise, who is the Deputy Director General for Natural Resource Management, will facilitate a panel discussion that will start just after 11, around 11:15. So we have an interesting and packed program, and we're grateful for the speakers as well as sector experts who will be joining us today. We've got investment fund managers, we've got deal makers in the cannabis sector and the whole industry throughout the country. They will share with us their insights into what is the cannabis investment landscape looking like and how as a province can we contribute to the objective of industrializing the cannabis sector as articulated in our provincial plan of Growing Gauteng Together 2030, which we call GGT 2030 plan. So we are going to kick off our program, and I just want to check if the head of department who will be giving welcome remarks is already tuned in. And she will then give us opening and welcome remarks. Then she will be followed by the chairperson of the board of the Innovation Hub, who's also the deputy chairperson of the Gauteng GGDA, Gauteng Growth and Development Agency, Dr. Chiliz Rajitanga. Dr. Chiliz Rajitanga is standing in on behalf of MEC Tau, who is unable to join us due to EXCO meeting. So he will deliver the keynote address on behalf of MEC Tau. So HOD May Matilda, if you are ready, you're welcome to put on your camera and give us the opening and welcome remarks. I want to call upon all the delegates to assist to save on bandwidth and connectivity, that you do not put cameras on if you are able to do so. The platform that we are utilizing has enabled microphones as well as cameras, but some are able to still come through and put on their cameras. So we'll just like to call upon everyone not to put their cameras on, so that we could then save on bandwidth for those that might be not having a very good connectivity. So I'm going to then hand over to our leader, our head of department for Department of Agriculture and Rural Development, May Matilda Kasela, to give us opening and welcome remarks. And then directly after May Matilda Kasela, Dr. Chiliz Rajitanga will be ready to give us the keynote address on behalf of our MEC. So May Matilda, over to you. You may proceed to give us opening and welcome remarks.
Thank you very much, Program Director, Mr. Mutlacho Makaipea. A very good morning to everyone on the call. As has already been said, my name is Matilda Kasela. I'm Head of Department for Agriculture and Rural Development. I also come with very warm greetings from the MEC. I think Ntate Motlatso has already informed us that MEC is not going to be with us this morning because he's attending EXCO. Unfortunately, he's been unable to get out of EXCO, not because this engagement is not important, but EXCO becomes a priority for all members of the Executive Council. Let me then start by heartily welcome Dr. Chiliz Rajitanga. Ntate Motlatso has already informed us that he's chairperson of the Innovation Hub Management Company, but he also is also deputy chair of the Gauteng Growth and Development Agency, which is also called the GGDA. He is amongst the core of people who have been given the very big responsibility of driving the economic recovery of this province and therefore of the entire country. As the saying goes, when Gauteng sneezes, the whole country catches a cold. Welcome to the second webinar in a series of 4 webinars aimed at engaging the various stakeholders involved in harnessing the growth of the Gauteng cannabis and hemp industry. In the first webinar, we held a very successful engagement with the industry and 2 presentations from national government, specifically the Department of Health Agency, which is called the South African Health Products Regulatory Agency, SAPRA, who outlined for all of us medical licensing cannabis. We also had presentation from the Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development, which is also called DALD, who outlined for us the process to apply for hemp industrial license. Today, we look forward to another successful webinar that will discuss and advise on how we can leverage as well as increase investment and financing. The third webinar will specifically discuss the cannabis SMME development, cannabis development hubs, which include incubation and market access, whilst the last webinar will be focused on the skills development and research towards enhancing competitiveness of the sector. The following objectives are envisaged to be achieved through this particular webinar: to provide a platform for dialogue between cannabis stakeholders in promoting industrial cannabis investment and financing, to encourage public-private partnership in the cannabis sector with a view of coordinating investment and financing, to stimulate engagements and development of potential solutions around cannabis investment, to also give insight that can promote economic development and reindustrialization in the province through the development and support of the cannabis sector. It is more critical that we should engage with the broader industry in our endeavor to contribute to the growth of this industry, as success and impact can be derived from having partnerships more than working in silos. The South African economy is currently under pressure, as we all know, with the ever-present threat of further economic downgrades, the triple challenge of high unemployment, increased poverty levels, rising inequality figures, and a shrinking GDP. Risks of further downward revisions remain high as COVID-19 continues to affect economic activity and trade worldwide. Following an already weak economy prior to the pandemic, it is becoming increasingly likely that the global and local economies could suffer years of uncertainty, as the impact of the COVID-19 has already pushed global GDP growth to the slowest pace since the global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, unless aggressive investment is made in how growth sectors such as cannabis. The industrialization of cannabis certainly has a great potential of creating job opportunities, of growing the economy, of also promoting township SME development and inclusive participation. As I conclude, colleagues, I would like to highlight that this platform furthermore serves an important aspect of our consultative sessions for developing strategic documents and implementation plans that will guide the support and development of the cannabis industry in Gauteng. Once more, I would truly like to welcome everyone, and I look forward to the presentation and panel discussions that will be undertaken by our esteemed panelists and speakers. Welcome, everybody, and as has already been said, we're really hoping for a very fruitful engagement with all of yourselves. Thank you very much, Program Director. Over to you again.
Thank you very much, Ms. Matilda Gasela, the Head of Department for the Provincial Department of Agriculture and Rural Development. Thank you for the warm welcome to all our delegates. We, as I've indicated, we have among our delegates activists, we have members of legislature, we have traders, we have investment fund managers, all of them. You're welcome once again, and thank you, Ms. Matilda, for welcoming everyone. We're now going to move to the second item, which will be the keynote address that will be delivered by Dr. Chiliz Rajitanga. He's the Deputy Chairperson of GGDA Board of Directors. He's also the Chair of the Board of the Innovation Hub Management. He graduated with his PhD from the Biden School of Public Policy and Administration at the University of Delaware in the USA. And he's worked for provincial government. At some stage, he served as the spokesperson for the MEC of Education, and he also served in the Premier's office. And he subsequently joined private sector and became involved in a number of business initiatives. Without further much waste of time, Dr. Chiliz, I'd like to hand over to you to deliver the keynote address. Over to you, sir.
Good morning, and thank you very much. As it has already been indicated that I have the singular honor this morning to represent the MEC, who would like to send his best regards and warm greetings to you all, and also wishing that this webinar will be a success. I would therefore also like to greet everybody who's here with us today, including the Head of Department of Agriculture and Rural Development, Ms. Matilda Gasela, the Head of the Department of Economic Development in the province, Mr. Blake Mosley Lifatula, all senior managers and officials of the said two departments, representatives of the cannabis and hemp industry, investment entrepreneurs, and notably all the speakers on our program. And we thank you for availing yourself to form part of this program. Representatives of other government departments and other provincial departments of agriculture and economic development, partner institutes such as universities, Agricultural Research Council, the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, farmers, agro-processors, and broader sector representatives along the value chain. I therefore greet you this morning with reverence. The Gauteng provincial government continues to facilitate and promote economic growth and development in our province with a targeted commitment to focus on enhancing inclusivity of the economy whilst improving its competitiveness. The Growing Gauteng Together 2030 strategic goals include driving spatial and economic transformation, particularly with respect to townships. Hence, we have the Township Economic Revitalization Strategy. Creating employment for the unemployed, facilitating employment for all classes of disadvantaged citizens. coordinating industrialization initiatives so that they are geared towards products and services required by the 10 high growth sectors and thus are sustainably financeable. These 10 high growth sectors are energy, with a focus on new technologies and a diverse energy mix, transportation and logistics, ICT and digital services with a focus on the gig economy, tourism and hospitality, food, beverages, agro-processing and agribusiness, construction and infrastructure, automotive, aerospace and defense, financial services, cultural and creative services, and notably, industrial cannabis. The introduction of the licensing framework for cultivation and manufacture of medical cannabis and hemp industrialization, as led through the National Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development, opens new investment opportunities in Gauteng and South Africa at large. As the province of Gauteng, we aim to attract significant investor interest based not only upon our strategic location and comparative advantages, such as academic and research institutions, public infrastructure, the biopharmaceutical and agro-processing sectors, but also through leveraging our intentions of investing in the transformation, modernization, and reindustrialization of Gauteng. The transformation intent of our government relates to societal as well as economic transformation. We aim to transform the economy to become more inclusive, thereby creating a more harmonious society. We also aim to transform the economy through innovation and modernization. Innovation is a crucial catalyst for the modernization of our economy. The current state of the cannabis industry in South Africa requires innovation and modernization at an industrial scale. Thus, it perfectly fits within the Gauteng government's intent of transformation, modernization, and reindustrialization of our economy and province at large. Guided by the draft National Master Plan, we have identified key areas of significance that we are currently focusing on, as articulated in the interim provincial strategy. These areas include to contribute to a seamless regulatory and legislative framework, to accelerate implementation of provincial customized national master plan through coordination with national government, stakeholder mobilization, including dialogues through workshops and webinars, as we are doing currently with this second webinar, resources mobilization and financing, including through investment facilitation, small enterprise support, district development hubs for inclusivity and market access, research and development, as well as skills development. The Gauteng provincial government is mobilizing financial resources with the objective of capitalizing the development and industrialization of cannabis, utilizing various instruments that will include grants, loans, and blended finance, depending on the specific aspect of the value chain. The province, working with the industry, as well as leading academic universities and research institutions, continues to position itself as the leading agro-industrial investment destination through implementation of the Provincial Economic Recovery Plan that is based on 4 pillars, namely investment in special economic zones and the 10 high growth sectors, of which cannabis is one of them, investment through public-private partnerships, investment in infrastructure, and investment in supporting SMME growth and development. At the end of the day, an economy that has attained growth should demonstrate such in the jobs that have been created. Our people do not comprehend such things as jobless economic growth. It is our hope, therefore, that the huge projections that have been bandied about regarding the potential in the cannabis industry will herald the much-needed jobs for our people, let alone the transformation of our economy. Experts have indicated that by 2023, the value of Africa's legal cannabis market could be worth over $7.1 billion. The medicinal cannabis market of South Africa is projected to reach $667 million by 2023, and is also expected to create approximately 2,500 full-time jobs. It is anticipated that Gauteng will contribute immensely to this target. Globally, the legal cannabis market has witnessed significant growth over the past few years and was established to be worth approximately $52.8 billion in 2019. Furthermore, the global legal cannabis market value is forecast to increase by 14.5% from 2020 to reach $103.9 billion by 2024. The government has been pushing hard for South Africa to become heavily invested in the cannabis industry. We're encouraged by some of the exciting local investments into the cannabis industry. For example, South Africa's first cannabis fund, Silver Leaf Investments, has made its opening investment into a local medical cannabis facility. Silver Leaf Investments is a registered Section 12J venture capital company set up to invest in new asset class of cannabis. The company entered, and they will be talking today in our webinar, so we'll hear more from them. This company entered into a joint venture with Druids Holdings, a licensed medicinal cannabis cultivator with a growing facility near Johannesburg. Druids will also be part of our program today. The grower is one of the first to secure a major multi-year international supply agreement with a leading Australian Leaf and Highlands Investments for 650 million rand. It's also notable. Labat Africa, which is a company, Labat Africa's 11.25 million rand investment for 75% of chemicals is also very crucial. The emergence of Black industrialists in the cannabis sector has been noted and is encouraging, which includes Hermetics, Health, etc. And it's also encouraging for our province to learn that 11 of the 29 licenses by SAPRA are based here in Gauteng. The Gauteng government, through its own state-owned agency, the Innovation Hub, as it has been stated, I'm chairman of, has also invested seriously in the incubation of companies that are pursuing the varied value chains within the cannabis industry. The Innovation Hub acts as a direct contributor to enhance the economic growth and the global competitiveness of Gauteng through innovation and investments in the knowledge. Currently, the Innovation Hub has incubated the following companies in the cannabis industry. Agri-Smart Engineering. Incubated from March 2020, Agri-Smart Engineering is an agri-tech company that focuses on developing cultivation technologies. Their technological output is custom-led cultivation lights and a closed-loop hydroponic system for cannabis cultivation. The company is in the process of submitting their cultivation license application with SAPRA and are preparing for the site for final inspection. The support that has been provided includes that the company got the recognition award in 2020 of the Gauteng Accelerator Program within the biosciences category within the Innovation Hub. Agri-Smart is in the process of establishing a commercial cannabis facility. Once the finalized, additional support will include commercialization of fixtures, regulatory compliance, and intellectual property support. The next company is Vida Pharmaceuticals. Vida Pharmaceuticals manufactures pharmaceutical-grade bioactives from medicinal plants. The bioactives are used in the production of pharmaceuticals to treat different diseases. The company has been incubated at the Innovation Hub from February 2019. With support from the Hub, the business managed to obtain its medicinal manufacturing license from SAPRA. Offtake agreements were secured for raw materials, that is cannabis leaves and apis, which is an active pharmaceutical ingredient. To demonstrate the capital-intensive nature of this industry, Vida requires 70 million rand for commissioning of the current facility, which includes equipment and cultivation sites. The next company is The Root, incubated in December 2020. This company focuses on the extraction and refining of the full spectrum of cannabinoids into highly purified concentrates from cannabis and hemp. They supply crude oil and highly purified concentrates of cannabinoids to various industries. And part of the support that was offered is intellectual property support, which ensured that the novelty of the patent was done and shared with the entrepreneur. Linkages with universities for research work and possible studies on the biosynthesis production of cannabinoids using yeast, bacteria, or algae. And the company also requires seed funding to get the business off the ground. And as a result of which, external funding is being facilitated for the company. It is important to realize that we are behind when it comes to the advanced cannabis industry. I'm sure you are aware of Nevada, California, Holland. Some of those markets are much larger cannabis industry markets. There are companies that are years ahead of us. There are countries that are years ahead of us. This is actually paradoxical because South Africa and our neighboring countries in the Southern African region have been a haven for cannabis products for decades, albeit these were not legally regulated and were also not being traded at an industrial scale. This means that we have our own indigenous heritage insofar as cannabis is concerned. The big question is whether we'll be able to massify and scale to the levels of industrialization in a way that does not bury the indigenous traders of cannabis who have been trading cannabis for decades in our shores. Hence, we must commit to the principles that industrial cannabis should be economically inclusive and involve indigenous traders in its legislation, innovation, and modernization. The government is aware that current legislation, despite the private use of cannabis being decriminalized by the Constitutional Court in 2018, is a major hurdle in realizing the economic potential of commercialization. The Cannabis for Private Purposes Bill, still to be approved by Parliament, does not make provision for the commercialization of cannabis. And until amendments are made to the Drugs and Drug Trafficking Act to better align with the Medicines Act, which governs the cultivation, manufacture, distribution, import, and export of THC-containing medicines, industrialization remains prohibited, as noted by the Department of Trade, Industry, and Competition. What is good is that the Cannabis Master Plan places great importance on the establishment of a sustainable seed supply system, which will require all companies involved with the breeding, multiplication, and scale of cannabis seed to be registered and certified. The plan proposes that government supplies certified cannabis seeds and other startup production inputs to new small-scale farmers. Led by the Department of Science and Innovation, the master plan focuses on breeding new cultivars and strains of cannabis. This is to support a wide range of production, including cannabis used for food, medicine, beverages, textiles, construction material, and cosmetics. This also includes the adoption of technology like water and light systems, which will help farmers to produce high-yielding crops, specifically aimed at supporting small-scale and traditional cannabis farmers. The plan involves the inclusion of current illegal dacha growers into the formal system. Technical support offered to these farmers include information on cultivar choices, cultivation practices, pest and disease control, harvesting, and post-harvest practices. Financial support will be offered in the form of grants and loans to help farmers get started in the formal market. Zoning for cannabis farming will be prioritized in the areas where poverty and unemployment is high, according to the Cannabis Master Plan. Led by the Department of Trade, Industry, and Competition, the plan aims to position South Africa as a key exporter of cannabis. It also proposes that government purchases cannabis products from resource-poor farmers and manufacturers, with incentives offered to suppliers the local and export market. It includes the development of new processing plants and storage facilities to meet both local and international demand. Indigenous dacha growers and sellers are prioritized in the plan. The Department of Small Business Development is tasked with the developing and implementing special incubation programs for new suppliers. The department is also tasked with facilitating off-take agreements between cannabis growers and manufacturers. To develop South Africa's cannabis manufacturing capacity, the plan relies on investments from government, private sector, donors, and state-owned entities. This includes the establishment of manufacturing plants, which will produce materials and products from raw cannabis for both the local and international market. Led by the Department of Higher Education and Training, with support from the Department of Basic Education, the Cannabis Master Plan looks to develop formal and informal training programs on cannabis growing and manufacturing. This will see cannabis-related courses included in the curriculum of schools, colleges, and universities, with support from the sector education and training authorities. In conclusion, coordination of joint actions within industry to grow the industrial cannabis sector and investment facilitation into this sector, including through the Special Economic Zones Network, should be non-negotiable. To summarize, some of the most important actions that we have to monitor and ensure that they happen without fail include, number one, coordination of joint actions with industry to grow the industrial cannabis sector, working with the relevant authorities to develop a regulatory sandbox to coherently regulate the sector in our province, investment facilitation into the sector, including through the Special Economic Zone Network, facilitating Black industrialist participation in the sector, including supplier and enterprise development for value chain inclusion, and lastly, clusters of smallholder farming connecting into industrial agro-processing, including cannabis industrialization. I hope that this webinar contributes to all these targeted objectives, and that through this stakeholder mobilization and engagement, we will definitely see the high growth of the cannabis industry within our province, and that should be able to encourage the growth in the entire country. Thank you very much. Thank you, Program Director.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rajitanga, for a message for the keynote address. We're grateful for highlighting the reasons why GPG has decided to invest in an industrialized cannabis, and also for pointing out the opportunities that can be created through increased investment and financing of entrepreneurs in this sector, and also for highlighting the companies that require investment. I think you mentioned a number of startups that are situated at the Innovation Hub that the investment managers and fund managers that are in this session today may have keen interest to look into and to engage with those companies. And also to highlight the issues relating to indigenous knowledge systems. That is very critical for a lot of participants that are in this session. And also the issues that relates to unlocking the regulatory framework. Thank you very much, Dr. Chiliz, for that keynote address. And now we are going to move on to the presentation by Mr. Sibusiso Qaba, who is representing ACA Group. He's the founder and CEO of ACA Group, which is a leading service provider that specializes in the cannabis industry. And he is also a seasoned finance professional, having worked at Goldman Sachs and Investec in London over 8 years, and has extensive experience covering Africa. Mr. Sibusiso, we welcome you, and I would like to hand over to you to take us through the challenges of capital investment in the cannabis industry. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank the Gauteng Provincial Government for organizing today's timely webinar. The Gauteng Provincial Government has demonstrated its focus and commitment towards developing a robust cannabis industry that will create much needed jobs and economic opportunities for South Africans. We're honored and excited to be part of today's program. As introduced, I'm the co-founder and CEO of Africa Cannabis Advisory Group, a services provider specialized in the medical cannabis and industrial hemp sectors. ACA Group works with a broad range of industry stakeholders, including governments, corporates, entrepreneurs, investors, and institutions, and specializes in the creation and execution of cannabis projects. We have a strong focus on strategy development, investor readiness, capital raising, global sales and distribution, and technology solutions. Prior to moving back to South Africa and starting ACA Group, I worked as an investment banker in the UK for 8 years, specializing in capital raising and deal structuring for African governments, corporates, pension funds, central banks, and other financial institutions. Using this experience, we have positioned our business as a partner that can help cannabis stakeholders on the continent build an inclusive, high-impact, and globally competitive industry. Our mission is to see Africa realize its potential as a cannabis superpower, creating jobs and opportunities for its citizens. Now, the cannabis industry has undoubtedly undoubtedly emerged as one of the fastest growing and high potential industries in the world over the last 10 years. From being perceived as a dangerous, addictive, and hazardous drug to now being recognized as a medical marvel, a breakthrough industrial material, and an effective mental health aid, we have seen one of the fastest shifts in perceptions of any substance in our lifetime. Cannabis is now legal or decriminalized in over 40 countries and is estimated to be worth over $40 billion. North America is the engine room for today's cannabis industry, with the US and Canada representing an industry size of over $25 billion and growing at over 20%. Europe follows very closely behind, with countries such as Germany, Spain, Portugal, and the UK positioning to be global leaders in the cannabis industry. Israel, which has been using medical cannabis for over 25 years, is a leader in cannabis research and development. South Africa is about 7 years behind North America in terms of the development of its local cannabis industry, but has many compelling natural advantages that can propel it to being a global leader when it comes to this exciting space. However, behind the billion-dollar headlines that we see about cannabis and all the excitement is an industry that is actually extremely difficult to understand and navigate. The cannabis industry has an extremely high business failure rate, and despite many success stories to date, billions have been lost by investors across the globe. It's no wonder that despite its well-documented potential, there's such a strong focus on how capital is raised and deployed in the industry and why so many investors remain cautious. These realities about the cannabis industry are often overlooked when we think about the potential of this industry. However, we feel that it's very important to understand the global and local cannabis landscape in order to best position for long-term success as governments, entrepreneurs, individuals, and communities. So what makes capital so challenging and raising capital so challenging within the cannabis industry? And how do we position for long-term success despite all of these uncertainties? So firstly, to touch on some of the structural realities in the cannabis industry that do make it quite a challenging space to navigate and to build businesses, we have to look at a few dynamics globally. Firstly, despite the fact that we've been seeing headlines about the cannabis industry for many years, the cannabis industry is actually still in its infancy. Across medical, industrial, and adult use cannabis, we've only just begun to scratch the surface in terms of understanding and developing the broad range of applications of this plant. The legal cannabis industry is actually still being created, and it comes with consistent changes and developments which make positioning for the future quite challenging. The uncertainty about this future can be seen in cannabis share price movements, which are ranked amongst the most volatile sectors in capital markets. Secondly, due to the complicated history of the plant, cannabis is still largely treated as a Schedule I narcotic, meaning that governments are taking a very cautious approach to legalizing and regulating the industry. As it stands, there are only 2 countries in the world that have legalized recreational cannabis commercially, that being Uruguay and Canada. Often enthusiastic corporates and entrepreneurs struggle with the slow pace of regulatory development, as seen in South Africa, but in many other parts of the world. And it takes time for the industry to calibrate to the pace of regulatory developments and to ensure that precious capital isn't wasted as these entrepreneurs and these stakeholders look to establish themselves in this in the global environment. Thirdly, the standards, processes, and business best practices for cannabis are still being established across cultivation, processing, and trade. 2020 was the first year that saw large-scale cannabis international export and import. The largest import of cannabis was Israel, with roughly 17 tons worth of cannabis flower being imported into that country. These are relatively low volumes. However, we do expect this to grow exponentially in coming years, but from a low base. Over time, these structural challenges will ease. For example, high-cost producers found mostly in North America and in the Northern Hemisphere will begin to slowly exit the cultivation space, creating an opportune environment for lower-cost producers such as South Africa to play a significant role in cannabis cultivation and export. More countries are also expected to legalize cannabis and make patient access easier, resulting in a larger and growing total addressable market. However, the context of these headwinds is very important to understand as we plan as a country and as a province on how we are going to position ourselves as an industry. When we zone into the African and South African cannabis industry, capital has been one of the major challenges for development. Over the last 4 years, we estimate that about $250 million has been raised by African cannabis operators, with Lesotho attracting over 200 million of invested capital. Most of this capital has been deployed by international investors and operators from Canada, Europe, and Israel. Today, the foreign direct investment landscape is more challenging as investors have become more selective on their projects, and cultivation no longer being the bottleneck that it once was within the industry. This means that local investors are going to have to step in and really provide the fuel that will drive the growth and development of this industry. Now, what can be done to unlock investor capital to help us develop the cannabis industry in Gauteng and in South Africa? We believe that the single biggest opportunity to build our cannabis industry lies in the development and the calibration of a domestic cannabis market, and not so much an international cannabis market, as has often been the core thesis and belief of many cannabis entrepreneurs and operators to date. We have millions of citizens who suffer from medical conditions where cannabis can help relieve some of these symptoms, including cancer, epilepsy, autoimmune diseases, anxiety, stress, chronic pain, diabetes, just to name a few. However, we are yet to create a large-scale framework that can allow patients in South Africa to access locally grown medical cannabis. Once we begin to create and implement this framework, we believe that the investment case for local cannabis operators improves drastically. The domestic development of the cannabis industry also applies to industrial hemp, which offers compelling opportunities for our country. Hemp is known to have over 55,000 end products that can be developed from the plant. With the focus on domestic consumption, we can create sustainable products ranging from protein powders to paper to hempcrete for the construction industry. Investment capital will naturally flow once we develop the products and the market and configure these together to create a robust ecosystem. The adult use market is also one that is particularly important to South Africa. With over 900,000 estimated smallhold and rural cannabis growers and over 2.8 million consumers, shifting the activities within the illicit market into a legal framework is imperative for us to achieve our objectives of job creation, rural development, and economic upliftment of our people. The National Cannabis Master Plan does give a clear indication that government intends to create a conducive environment for the cannabis industry to thrive across medical, industrial, and recreational cannabis. However, the devil will be in the detail. For example, if we do not develop processing and manufacturing infrastructure in tandem with our hemp cultivation initiatives, we could see ourselves in a very similar situation to the one experienced in the USA, where hemp legalization resulted in thousands of hectares of hemp being grown, but no end market or product use being established, leaving many with unsold product and significant losses. Similarly, models that do not include illicit market growers could see further inequality and social instability as the legal cannabis industry develops. Despite the many challenges that face the international and local cannabis industry, there's little doubt about the economic and social potential that this industry represents for South Africa, the Gauteng Province, and local and international investors. If we focus on developing a domestic cannabis industry that solves our domestic needs and problems across medical conditions, industrialization, mental health, and we develop a regulatory environment that is conducive, investment friendly, and innovative in its application, there's no doubt that investment capital and entrepreneurial talent will flow into this industry. At a time when South Africa faces insurmountable economic challenges, we have the opportunity to bring this industry to life in a way that can bring thousands of South Africans out of poverty and create sustainable jobs. The irony is that in focusing on a domestic industry, we naturally begin to understand the plant in a way that allows us to develop a competitive advantage that enables South Africa to develop intellectual property and expertise that can be exported to the world and truly make us a cannabis superpower. We are thankful for today's opportunity to give a snapshot of some of the challenges and market structural issues that are present in the global and local cannabis industry today. And we're excited for the journey that the Gauteng provincial government is about to embark on alongside industry stakeholders and partners to bring this industry to fruition. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sbusiso Baba, for highlighting the challenges of capital investment in the cannabis industry, for indicating the headwinds as well as the tailwinds in terms of what needs to be done to ensure that this sector is catapulted to what it can be. You have highlighted a number of key important issues in terms of structural challenges and basically with the understanding that the industry is still in its infancy and there's a lot that has to be done for it to really grow and achieve the potential that it can achieve. We're looking forward now to furthermore unlocking investments and notably developing the domestic market, because you have highlighted the most important factor that without developing the domestic market, we might be faced with situations that was faced by a number of key growers in countries such as the US, where they invested, but there was no uptake of their products. So I think those are some of the key issues that we really have to be mindful of. And I want to believe that some of the speakers that will be following will also touch on how do we circumvent that challenge that you have highlighted. Thank you very much, Mr. Sbusiso. And we are going to move now to Mr. Kasif Isaacs, who's one of the investment fund managers. He is attached to Mergence investment company, and he will certainly take us through the lessons that have been learned from an institutional investor perspective. Mergence Fund Managers is one of those companies that are already making some great investments in this particular sector. Mr. Kasif is head of the private markets at Mergence Investment Managers. He's been with the company from 2015. He's a qualified chartered accountant with specific focus on energy, industry, infrastructure, as well as impact. And he's a graduate of BCom from University of the Western Cape, and he has helped develop the Mergence Infrastructure and Development Equity Fund as a senior investment principal. Mr. Kasif, I'd like to hand over to you, sir, to proceed with the presentation on the lessons that have already been learned as an institutional investor. Over to you. You may proceed with the presentation.
Good morning, everybody. I just, if I lost technology just as you handed over to me, Chair. Just bear with me 1 second while I restart the presentation.
No problem. I will read the rest of your profile.
I'm ready to go. I just want to make sure
You're
that
ready to go. That's fine. So you can proceed. You can proceed.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity. Like Mr. Taba, we are very humbled and honored to be able to share our experiences from investing in the medicinal cannabis sector in Lesotho. I'm going to start with a brief introduction to Mergence, and then talk about our lessons learned and what we see as some of the considerations that Gauteng needs to think about and plan around in terms of mobilizing capital and opening up cannabis cultivation in Gauteng. So just briefly, Mergence was established in 2004. We are a fully independent investment house with a 14-year track record. We offer products in both the listed and private market space. We more than subscribe to ESG considerations and responsible investments. It is deeply embedded in our investment processes across both the private and public market space. We currently manage about 34 billion Rand, and 4 billion of that sits in the private market space that I'm overall responsible for, and about 30 billion in the listed space. Our philosophy is very much built around shared value. So we believe that, put it differently, impact has come of age, and it is our responsibility to offer pension funds and their members a blend of capital returns and investment returns, as well as social impact returns. And this is why the medicinal cannabis space for us is an exciting area. We've already deployed capital in Lesotho in this space, and we are assessing now the South African opportunity set and engaging with our investors around mobilizing capital in the South African market as well. Just to give you a snapshot of how long we've been active in the space, or maybe before I talk about that, I think one key important consideration that we can touch on again is from an institutional investor's perspective. It is likely that we're only going to continue to invest in the medicinal cannabis space. So recreational will fall within the areas outside the outside mandate for most of us, for two reasons. One is it will fall in the kind of sin taxes category, similar to tobacco and alcohol, and institutional investors are less likely to deploy capital into those areas. And it will also sit outside the IFC exclusion areas. As Mr. Kaba mentioned, it is still a Schedule 1 drug, so it will be difficult to mobilize capital, institutional capital certainly, into the recreational space. We are now invested in 2 Lesotho licenses. The first deal we did was back in 2017, and then the second one in 2019. I think the other, it also speaks to Gauteng, I think, being a late starter in terms of certainly on the continent. And as the other speakers mentioned, US, Canada has been in this space for a lot longer. The 2 licenses that we have invested in, the first one now is, and it's the first in Africa that is GMP certified and has started exporting, still at relatively small volumes, but has started exporting dried GMP certified flower into Europe. Second license facility is under construction. We expect that to come online late Q4 or early Q1 next year. In terms of what we've learned over the last 4 years, there's a couple of key hurdles to overcome. I think the first of those is GMP has become the de facto standard globally. It is very difficult to negotiate offtake agreements, arrange for product movement without GMP certification. The other component related to that is the demand is for full spectrum flower, and through GMP, off-takers and regulators want full traceability and quality control. So, without that sort of stamp of certification, it is extremely difficult to operate in this space. And we'll talk more about how that affects the opportunity in Gauteng later. The preference, for end-to-end licenses. So, we would definitely look to license holders that have control of the value chain from seed to final product. I think if you have sort of fragmented licenses where you can only focus on cultivation, or you can only focus on value add processing down the line, it becomes very difficult to keep that strict quality control standard that the GMP and customers expect. And then the third one, the import and export and the whole regulatory framework are at very different levels of maturity across all markets. Mr. Ngaba alluded to that earlier. We've got that pain of navigating that landscape, and just getting an export certificate, for example, within a country where you are fully licensed, is difficult enough. The import requirements on the other end is still maturing. So we have struggled. Luckily, the key markets that our license holders are targeting, they've got very strong partners in country that are able to navigate that landscape and work collaboratively with the license holder to move products cross border and into the target markets. The area where, sorry, just got a bit of a hiccup with the other area on the commercial side, as much as flower is the current big opportunity, there are only 20 or so certified GMP cultivators globally. We also see that in the medium term, flowers will become highly commoditized as more and more GMP accredited growers come online, and that's also part of why I said earlier that the integrated license we believe has a lot more value, because you will become commoditized in the cultivation space over the medium term. The other area, the establishment costs, which both Dr. Rajitanga and Mr. Zaba alluded to, it is a capital-intensive process to establish a fully production facility. And again, we'll talk shortly about how that may impact the opportunity in Gauteng. And as GMP and the theme, so it's a bit of a recurring theme, but it's a very important one that we all understand, that without the GMP certification, for an operator, even if you have a full permit and your facility is operational, you're going to have very limited revenue options. So you're going to face a high volatility in revenue as kind of pre-GMP, whether it's full spectrum or hemp only. You are going to struggle to move capital without the necessary approvals. In terms of translating this into more market-specific considerations, so what we see as some of the competitive advantages, Gauteng has these deep expertise in agriculture, and ultimately, certainly on the cultivation side, being able to nurture and grow this particular crop is a significant source of competitive advantage that we see. As much as it is a very hardy flower and is able to, I think the old analogy of, if you lose a few seeds in your garden, by design, you'll more than likely have quite a large crop of recreational flower within a couple of months without too much sort of effort beyond that. But shifting into commercial growth, that expertise of agriculture and the history we have in that space, we see that as a significant source of competitive advantage. I think we've also have, which we're all aware of, is there is significant workforce capacity. People both in and outside of the agriculture space, all aware of the need for meaningful and gainful employment, but we do have that workforce capacity available in the region. And then the third one, again, coming back to that GMP requirement, we do have in country and in Gauteng specifically deep expertise in both pharmaceutical certification and in GMP certification. So a lot of the consultants that our license holders used in Gauteng through its own GMP journey, in Lesotho rather, through its GMP journey were actually sourced from South Africa. Most of our key, what will be labeled your responsible pharmacist in the GMP process are South African. The cultivation managers responsible for optimizing and managing the grow side of the facility, again, mostly expertise sourced from South Africa. So we've got that know-how, we've got that capability, and we just need to bring those three together in order to try and move the industry forward. Here we see some of the challenges in the same breath for Gauteng. The ability to mobilize capital, and again, it needs to be a combination of both grant and commercial funding, including the institutional investor component to that. We're looking at, as much as we're looking at a multi-billion rand opportunity, it's going to take billions of rand to catch up with the rest of the world and establish these facilities we need. Again, coming back to GMP, because you need full traceability and full product control across the value chain, it becomes very, very difficult to operationalize an outgrow model. So how do we bring the small farmers, small producers rather, who has historically supplied the recreational market, the black market in reality, into a model where we are able to offer that full product control and traceability, where we can test quality throughout the cultivation process. So levels of, for example, things like heavy metals, pesticides, all of those needs to be carefully monitored and very strictly controlled, because ultimately this is a pharmaceutical grade product that will be available over time, either in over-the-counter medicines as well, as a active ingredient, as well as prescription medicine. So that same mindset of, and this is why the GMP accreditation has become the de facto standard, is that you need to have effectively putting the product in the consumer's hands, and it therefore needs to be very careful quality control and the ability, for example, to recall a batch when you do have an issue. I don't think we have the answer yet, but how do we create that environment where we can have all of those controls in place, but at the same time allow growers to partner with smaller producers? And then the last one, I think from our perspective, certainly an end-to-end integrated license is key to success. I think fragmentation around cultivation versus processing is going to make it very difficult to grow the businesses to scale. And the demand globally is for high active THC component and not the more sort of cannabinoid hemp-focused cultivation. We've seen that some of our customers and potential customers are looking for a minimum of 20% THC. So again, finding that balance and allowing the domestic license holders to cultivate end to end, and also allow 20% plus THC component. From our experience, are key success factors that needs to be considered as Gauteng embarks on its cannabis journey. Chair, that is the key messages and experiences from our perspective. I have allowed a few minutes for questions, but Chair, in your hands, whether you're going to facilitate that during the panel discussion, or do you want to allow maybe 2 or 3 key questions?
Thank you, Mr. Kasif. We are going to take all questions during the panel discussion. And we have also deactivated the chat for now. We will activate the chat so that anyone who has a question can actually fill the questions through the chat, because we've got a large attendance and we might not be able to manage in terms of time. We've only scheduled the session for 2.5 hours. So what we are then saying now is that anyone who has got a question must note it, and then we will activate the chat when the next speaker takes to the podium, Mr. Ayanda Bam, and then all those questions will then allow everybody to then be able to respond during the panel discussion. So thanks Mr. Kasif for a excellent presentation in terms of the regulatory considerations, the commercial aspects to be noted, particularly the issues around how the licensing framework can be modified to ensure seamless operations, and also to highlight the suggestions in terms of how the challenges that are there can be addressed, particularly issues such as the integration of artisanal growers together with the commercial growers. So thank you very much for that. The question I would basically want to ask from you as the fund managers is in terms of your scope, your fund that you have available to invest in some of the growers. Perhaps during the panel you can then be able to expatiate a little bit more on that in terms of what is the size of the fund and all those considerations at the entity level for you to ultimately take it as viable for investment. Thank you very much. I'm going to call on Mr. Ayanda Bam to come to put his video on and microphone on. Mr. Ayanda Bam is going to talk to us about investment readiness along with access to pools of investors across the globe. Just to give you a bit of a short background about Mr. Bam, he is one of the seasoned specialists in this sector. We had him in our previous webinar as well, where he spoke at length around the regulatory hurdles, an expert of note. And I don't want to waste time because we are going to have a panel discussions that basically I'm sure people are burning with questions. And Mr. Bam, I just want to hand over to you to kickstart the presentation. And as I've indicated, our producers towards the end of your presentation would activate the chats so that everyone who has a question can then put their questions through. And then during the panel discussions, all the questions will then be answered. So over to you, sir. You can proceed with the presentation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Chairperson, and good morning to all of our audiences. I certainly am humbled by the very kind words in your introduction. I think it's really important to say it's fantastic to see that some of the efforts that are being moved around commercialization and industrialization of the industry is being done at the provincial level, and I'd certainly like to be able to commend Dr. Dar in Gauteng and on its efforts of prioritizing cannabis among its key priority sectors, particularly as a lever for job creation, for green industrialization, which we don't speak about enough, the economic diversification that we require, as well as considering these key items around inclusion and transformation. So for us, of course, access to finance is quite an enabler and an important enabler for achieving some of the ambitions I think we have made for ourselves broadly in the industry, but also in terms of the various kinds of national plans that are defining how the industry is going to be shaped going forward. Now, I think quite a lot of my esteemed colleagues have already touched on the various sort of supply side deficiencies that constrain access to finance and some of the sort of disabling regulatory environments or hurdles that we face. My presentation is a little bit different in the sense that I'm going to focus more on the demand side. So from the perspective of a business that's seeking to raise capital, and how you basically might think about various levers that can improve the effectiveness of some of these supply side interventions. I think to begin off, obviously the green rush that has been presented by the cannabis opportunity, I think creates sort of meaningful pathways for establishing profitable businesses and industrializing economies, but it also brings with it a unique number of risks. I think first and foremost, there are very few industries that have developed from illegality, and financial considerations are having to be made within a regulatory environment that often moves too slowly, that can be very highly unpredictable, and can be burdensome, very, very burdensome with regards to high compliance costs. I think the second thing is that the cannabis startup universe is littered with many businesses that have not demonstrated or are unable to demonstrate their ability to execute. Now, this is particularly important in an industry that is both nascent and complex, not least given that the many regulators and certainly most investors know a little bit less usually than some of the cannabis businesses that are seeking to raise capital. But I think what we've seen is a little bit of adjustment in the market, particularly over the last year with COVID, but not just to blame COVID. Some of the initial returns on cannabis investments have not been great. In some cases, you've had significant downscaling and divestments. And some of the crashes that we saw in various markets, including the performance in Lesotho and in California, where the black market seems to still be driving much of the revenue generation. It's sort of all of these things have created a confluence for us to actually start becoming a little bit more realistic about what is actually required to be able to raise capital here. I think the brutal truth to share is that only about 1 in 100, so 1% of ventures actually receive financing, and an even smaller proportion of those actually go on to run sustainable businesses past the dreaded death valley. But I think that's basically the bad news. The good news, however, is that of course there is actually quite a bit of capital that is available, both locally and internationally. And assuming an enabling environment, it needs to be able to find bankable ventures. So most of the principles, of course, around investment readiness pretty much apply similarly across all types of businesses. What I think a lot of folks sometimes seem to forget is that it's not the cannabis opportunity itself that drives the capital raising success, but it's the business and the management's ability to actually execute on that opportunity. On the basis of that, I mean, if you will indulge me, I'd like to share some of my own experiences in hopes that some among the audience might find some resonance with these, or perhaps even draw some insight from. I think first, as a cannabis entrepreneur that has successfully raised capital in an international market, and second, more recently as an advisor to both investors and capital raising businesses. So I'll begin with a journey from probably about 6 years ago now. My friend and I would spend a number of years basically watching cannabis liberalization take place across various states in the US. So we had, for example, celebrated Barack Obama's inaugural election in 2008 with the same enthusiasm as the passing of ballot number 1 issue in the state of Massachusetts that decriminalized cannabis use. I think while a lot of recent activity has focused in part on the legalized recreational cannabis trade, and many of the examples we use will sort of leverage a Uruguay or a Canada, the initial entry point for us was in the medical cannabis segment of the economy, with many states basically providing their citizens the opportunity to legally access cannabis-based medicines, something that we don't have in South Africa currently, except through one small provision in the law. But in effect, the prospect of working in cannabis for us was much more appealing than the corporate jobs we'd been in. But it occurred to us that while we had been experts in the consumption of cannabis and related products, Neither of us had any skills in growing it, never mind processing it into any kind of usable form, let alone for medicinal application, that anyone in their right mind would want to pay money for. On the one hand, the demand for cannabis was fairly indisputable, including for medicines, but we knew that we weren't in a position to compete with many businesses that often start off in production and maybe others in processing, and which we thought possessed more suitable capabilities than we did. And similarly, many businesses were establishing these points of sale for distribution. Many of you will be familiar with the dispensary model. And although it seemed a little bit more manageable, some of the capital and regulatory requirements were effectively too burdensome for us. So what we needed to do was effectively find a different entry point that allowed us to be competitive and to differentiate ourselves from other players. In effect, the way we thought about it was that we needed to find a different or maybe a smaller problem to solve, and then think about how we were going to source capital to finance it. So hence how began our investment readiness journey. So first thing we did, we mapped the cannabis value chain. We understood how it worked, identified where key constraints, pain points, and challenges were that could potentially lead to some sort of market failure. After extensive research and deliberations, we narrowed our focus on the customer journey for a medical cannabis patient or a consumer. So once the cannabis is on the market, how does the consumer go about sourcing it? And were there any ways of potentially improving that experience? In our case, our research uncovered that one, dispensaries or these points of sales were facing marketing and distribution challenges and struggled with new customer acquisition. And two, that patients had little knowledge about cannabis medicines and in many cases were located at great distances from those dispensaries. We were also at the time concerned about the implications in terms of liabilities of actually touching the cannabis at any stage of the trade process, given the kind of compliance and the permitting and licensing requirements that would come from that. But our hunch was that in a digital economy, technology would basically become a platform for driving a lot more of these innovative solutions to these problems. So we then registered a formal business and developed a landing page for our website. We funded much of this ourselves as a way of demonstrating our own commitment and skin in the game. And in parallel, we began looking at applications for the required permits and licenses that would allow us to operate and to understand some of the standards that were related to some of the, you've heard about GMP, there are different kinds of ISO standards around safety and quality. GMP refers to the manufacturing. GDP, which is not gross domestic product, refers to good distribution practices. Second thing that we did was we put together our brief business case and a little bit of a concept note around how this would work. So in effect, we would create a technology platform that allowed dispensaries to market their products and to be able to provide more information about different segments of their products, the kinds of effects, how somebody would be able to use it, onset, offset times, the kinds of side effects. And on the other hand, to be able to allow patients to be able to have that evidence base to learn about these various cannabis medicines and then be able to actually purchase them through an on-demand service. In turn, we basically realized that we were collecting quite an exceptional amount of data around the various supply demand dynamics. We're looking at various consumer preferences, and we're able to then figure out a way of being able to monetize some of that data and to be able to market it back to dispensaries as business intelligence. We also sort of imagined what the growth path would look like for the business. So it was clear to us, like with many other tech startups, it would take quite a bit of time to reach profitability, and it was going to require an extraordinary amount of effort. What we wanted to do was to start small and then grow organically, but establish very clear milestones for ourselves that we wanted to be able to reach along the way. After all, we weren't exactly sure of what we were doing, neither of us having had this prior experience then. And so it was very important for us to be very realistic about what we could possibly achieve. Third, we developed a financing strategy. We mapped out all of our full resource requirements. We understood what the human and financial costs would look like, and mapped this along a maturity cycle of our business. So what we knew what we needed in year one was going to be quite different to what we needed in year 5, but we needed to be able to kind of clear around how we could, rather than swallowing the elephant whole, eating it rather in chunks, and separating out potentially what that capital raise effort would look like. So what we then did, is at the same time as looking at some of these resources, we explored a number of partnerships to access some capabilities that we didn't have internally. So for example, around programming and coding. And this was also one of the ways that we thought it was important to be able to gain access to market, but also increase speed to market. The next thing we did was we mapped out the different financiers that were available. This is really important because, as you know, there are restrictions, for example, on institutional funds and what they can invest in, depending on the type of business that you have. But of course, we needed to understand the types of investors, what their expectations were, and what kinds of instruments that would possibly be available to us. So, for example, in our case, some of the debt financing options weren't particularly great because obviously you still have to amortize the loans over time, and you require some revenue generation capability to be able to repay those. So it wasn't particularly an attractive option, and we were looking for investors that were keen to sort of to disperse some of their capital more patiently, and who were looking at sort of bigger upside over a longer period of time. So what we then did is then prioritize these kinds of investors. We target and then went out and started engaging with various folks in the industry. This we did by attending various convenings, identifying different pools of networks of VCs, angel funders. We attended various webinars, very similar to the one here. And at the same time, we'd identified two business mentors who were going to coach us through the process. They didn't have any experience in cannabis, but were very useful in other areas. And at the same time, it was very important for us to start looking at sort of who the various customers were going to be. So starting to engage the various dispensaries, trying to get some expression of demand, soft LOIs. And separately, we'd worked with a partner company that allowed us to run focus group discussions and a survey of small medical marijuana patients to then understand what some of their needs were, to improve sort of our idea of understanding their customer journey, and then using that as a way of being able to implement into our work. Now, having had a feel of sort of what the various dynamics were, we were quite clear that then we needed to put together the various materials that are going to be suited particularly to this purpose. So of course, we went about putting together our investor materials in detail, you know, your basics, business plan, financial model, your investor pitch with a detailed investment memorandum. And at that point, we basically made sure that not only did we have these very good materials, but that we have a very good team that was able to demonstrate some ability to execute on this. It was particularly important in cannabis that investors feel that they can actually trust the people that they work with. I think in general, people give money to people that they like and that they trust. But where you're looking to actually take the investor along the journey as well of your growth, it's really important they feel that you actually have your own house in order. Once we then done and spent quite a bit of time stress testing, challenging, engaging with various friends, external colleagues, different family members, just to be able to pitch, practice pitching, get refinements, get feedback, and use that and integrate into the materials themselves. Finally, we had all of my materials prepared. We went to a little bit of a roadshow and presented our proposition to groups of these prioritized funders. We'd also developed a little data room that we'd use to basically make sure that all of our documentation was there. If there's any communication with funders, they could go directly there. And initially, we were expecting what we were told would be somewhere between a 3 to 18 month long process, and quickly found that because we were actually able to have such a great amount of preparation done, that cycle was literally 3 months long, and we're able to go through a very accelerated due diligence process. Of the 5 investors that we had prioritized, we received favorable responses from 3, and were able to secure $2 million in funding, with a small proportion of that, well, a large proportion in cash and a small proportion of that in consulting BDS services. Now, of course, we were very delighted about all of this, and I think a lot of the talk then was sort of feeling quite lucky, and because the number of ventures, of course, that succeeded were very, very limited. But it was actually my mother who reminded me of the age-old adage, which is basically that luck is where opportunity meets preparation. And I think this is a really important takeaway from one of these stories, this particular story here. And this is something that really applies to basically any kind of capital raising effort that you go through. And in fact, for most principles in life in general. Over the years, after I left Jane, I partnered up with another colleague at B-Cubed who used to be at Flowcana. They just finished raising $125 million in a Series B. And we'd put together sort of some ideas around how we might be able to provide an offering to the South African market in trying to create, in effect, investment readiness. And so I want to share some of the experiences or some sort of key takeaways that might be useful to some of you. I do appreciate that a number of folks on the call might be quite well versed with some of these, but I'm pointing at some few key takeaways that I think make this a little bit unique, but also that things that I think sometimes businesses forget. So the first thing is you need to build a good narrative. You know, it's one thing to be able to provide all of your great details and the robustness of your models, but the way that people buy ideas or concepts or even decide to give you cash is also being able to buy the stories with the details that you provide, adding basically color and the evidentiary support. Most people want to be able to hear your whole story. So how are you starting in day one? How are you thinking about growing over the next 5-7 years? How are you thinking about competitiveness? How are you going to make yourself particularly distinct? This is really important, and I think this goes along with any business. But usually, if you don't have a good narrative, then typically what it sounds like for a lot of investors is that you want to grow or you want to process without any clear idea around how that differentiates you from other potential investees. And not least in a market where I think the colleagues have mentioned previously that you're going to have very quick commoditization of the product. Second thing, build a good team. Again, it's almost better that you have an exceptional team to be able to execute with a relatively average idea than having a grand idea and then very limited ability to actually execute on that. So this is really important to make sure that you have a team. Again, you don't have to have all of the capabilities internally. Really do think about being able to partner up with others to be able to access some of these capabilities. The next thing, financing strategy. So I think most of the businesses that we engage with, a lot of them will have their financial plan. So you'll have your 3 statements, you'll have your projections out, but it isn't clear oftentimes sort of how you're thinking about for yourself. What does that financing look like over the maturity cycle of your business? Year 1 looks quite different to year 3, year 5. When do you think about scaling? How is that going to affect the kind of financing that you might look for, the types of financiers that you might actually go after? So this is like really, really important. And I think this is something that often businesses don't do alongside doing their business plans. Don't wait until the end to start thinking about the financing. The financing is a part of the development of your business strategy. The other 4th thing would be understanding the options and the financiers. I think my colleague Sibusiso spoke about some of these. Your angels, VCs, traditional banks, private equity, all of these are quite different. They have different expectations of your businesses. Again, the kinds of instruments, as I'd mentioned earlier, that are provided could make quite a difference in terms of how you actually operationalize your business. And of course, understanding what the various expectations of these financiers are. So I'm not gonna spend too much time there. But the 5th thing, this goes without saying, develop solid materials. I cannot stress this enough. If you have your basics done, you are a long way along the way of making sure that your process can be a little bit smoother and you can improve the chances of being able to succeed. But you need to be able to do quite a lot of the research. So you need to understand your market. What problems are you solving? Where are you going to be playing? Where are you focusing? What are the various segments? What are your geographies, your distribution channels? What are the various supply and demand dynamics? If, for example, you have a cultivation business, where are you sourcing your seed? Is that a challenge? What are the implications around that? Where is the stuff actually going to? Who's buying? How much? Is that in compliance, etc.? You need to understand your product very well. You need to be able to understand in detail your unit costs, be able to actually explain the growth of the product that you're looking or a service to put forward. Also, you need to really think about over that life cycle of your product, how do you ensure that you're constantly making yourself competitive? It might be that you have a unique selling proposition in year 5. in year 1, but in year 5, that can get eroded fairly quickly. I think it's important to also understand the enabling environment. This is particularly important if you are facing a lot of international investors who, on the one hand, are trying to sort of navigate the cannabis industry as it is, but on the other hand, navigating the regulatory environment, which is going to be quite specific to the different markets. If you're in Lesotho, it looks quite different to being here in South Africa. I think the other thing is, obviously, when you're thinking about the enabling environment, also think about what are the things that are actually driving some of these investment decisions. So we know, for example, carbon trading and carbon markets, access to ESG funds, the kind of pressure that investors are putting, or shareholders and investors are putting on businesses. There's quite a nice story that fits in quite well with cannabis. So you might think about ways of being able to sort of craft around sort of the low carbon transition. I think the final thing is certainly do engage with folks in industry. It's unfortunate at the moment in South Africa that you also don't have the ability of, for example, entities that create a pipeline of bankable businesses, right, for cannabis specifically into the investment community. But in areas where you do have the options for being able to get incubation or even acceleration, where it might be a combination of mentoring, coaching, then a small amount of seed funding, plus also access to a pool of other investors. But you need to be able to engage with folks just to be able to make sure that your proposition is always realistic and it's informed by key updates. So don't be afraid to certainly test the ideas. I know people can get very secretive. If you really do have something that is so unbelievably, confidential, and somebody else can easily replicate it, I think maybe you need to start asking yourself whether or not you have a sufficiently robust business to be able to compete in the market. And I think that's really, really important. But a couple of key messages just to close out here. The first one is really around where you play. The big focus has really been on cultivation and processing, but as you've seen from my own experience, our entry point was in nothing to do with either of those activities. And if you start looking, for example, in the hemp industry, you might see maybe even other opportunities that relate to processing, product development and manufacturing, not least because, for example, there is already an application, for example, of hemp fibers, in automotive composite development down in the Eastern Cape, or folks who are doing construction technology and making herds, using herds to make hempcrete. There are folks who are even looking at opportunities for extracting nanocrystalline cellulose from the plant and looking at actually marketing that. So don't constrain yourself to sort of these two kind of core areas. There are many other opportunities, and oftentimes investors can get quite excited by opportunities that seem to be a very kind of strategic or tactical kind of play on the part of the business, and sort of understanding how it sort of captures a particular market and how it maintains competitiveness. Second thing, it's more than capital. So when you are looking for investors, you have to make sure that the exchange value is actually fair. So it's one thing for you to go out there at the mercy of investors and ask for all of this money, but what you should be getting in return is not just the capital. You need to be able to also access sets of other capabilities that investors provide, and that can be very useful to your business. It might be around improving governance, it might be around access to markets, it might be around supporting with any kind of advocacy or lobbying efforts on the regulatory side. But as much as you're being evaluated by the investor, you also need to make sure that the institution or the entity or individual you're getting money from is actually one that's actually providing much more than the total sum of that cash. Third thing, and this is my second to last point, take it step by step. I think most folks have very large business propositions for hundreds of millions of rands. It's really difficult in this kind of industry, based on the dynamics I've said, to be able to sort of go whole hog. So think about sort of eating it in chunks and building up capability and demonstrating as you go along, and then incrementally increasing your capital raise. I'm not saying that it is a universal strategy, but in some cases it might make it a little bit easier for you to make the leap from having a business that has nothing to something that has maybe a little bit of capital, but that allows you to move a certain way towards your eventual goal. Finally, be patient. Deal closure does take time, as I've said. It can take up to 18 months, depending on the complexity of the deal or the process. But it's really important to understand what are the elements that you, as a business seeking capital, can actually do, which is basically prepare. If you are able to make sure that you are ready, it makes it much easier to be able to go out and very quickly streamline some of these processes. So I think with all of that, I may be a little bit over my allotted time, but I hope that that has been in some ways helpful. We at B-Cubed provide turnkey end-to-end services to both the private sector and to government, on the one side to enable the regulations, but on the other hand, to help you from the very beginning to even think about whether or not you want to play in this industry, to putting together your materials, to accessing market. So we are available to support, and I'd like to say, I think Godspeed basically to all of the various entrepreneurs that are budding. I think it's an exciting industry, and we will be happy to support in any ways that we can. Thank you so much, Chairperson, for the time.
Thank you so much, Ayanda, for an insightful presentation and taking us on a journey and sharing with us your experiences from setting up your enterprises in this sector and all the way to pitching to investors and particularly talking to the demand side, because I think that one of the threats from the initial speaker was around developing the markets, developing the domestic markets. And the demand side is very critical, because success of any investment, if the market is not clear, we likely that investment is likely to fail. So thank you very much for that insightful presentation. So we are going to move into a panel discussion, and I'm going to ask May Modise, who's going to facilitate the discussion for us, DDG Modise, to come through and take us through the discussion that is furthermore discussing this aspect of unlocking the Gauteng cannabis and hemp economy through investment and financing. As we have indicated, colleagues can they can do questions through the web, the chat, and we ask that the questions be very direct to all the speakers that have already presented, as well as those that will be in the panel. Memodise, without further much waste of time, I'd like to hand over to you and to take us through the last part of the webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Makaipia, and good morning to everyone on the call. We are running slightly behind schedule, so I will do my best to make sure that we make good use of the time that is left for us. Perhaps given the level of interest on this particular subject and given the need for us to continue engaging, we might make a plan that for the next 2 seminars that are remaining, we either have it over a longer period of time, or even do a hybrid kind of model as and when COVID-19 restrictions permit us. So to save us time, I will not, in terms of my panel, I will not read through the whole biographies. So if you really indulge me on that, we will definitely, through the different platforms where all participants received this invitation, we will be putting the full profiles of our speakers there. I also see that the chat has been opened and the questions are being noted even by my prospective panelists as well as the speakers that have come before them. And as we move towards a close, I'm going to request that they each respond to a number of questions that would relate to them. There are a number of requests for the chat recording to be shared, and we will make arrangements for that. So given the scene-setting discussion that we've had on this issue of investment and financing in cannabis, we would have had a number of key issues around, what are the challenges associated with investment from the different speakers that have come before us. We've heard that, issues around infrastructure and extraction would require much more capital boost for those that are in the field and those that are hoping to get into the cannabis sector to succeed. We then also really had very clearly that the regulatory framework would be quite critical for us to move with speed. We had already had a conversation on regulatory framework, and we do know that this is a space that is still very much developing and it's still very much immature. But I can say that from a national government perspective, we are seeing quite a lot of movement. Just about a week ago, we've had an engagement as provinces with the Deputy Minister on where we are with cannabis and what is it that needs to be pushed from their side. So there is that willingness to even hear from the sector, and also this process is a process that would help to enrich that particular dispensation as we get the different inputs. So let me then, without a further waste of time, introduce my panelists. I've got 4 members of this panel that will engage and share their different experiences around financing and investment on the cannabis space, from industrial to medicinal, and how they dealt with the different challenges that they would have, and also given the current restricted regulatory environment that we operate in. So the first person that's going to speak to us will be Pierre Van Der Hoeven, and Pierre will be from Silverleaf Investments. We also have Mr. Gavin Tonks, who's with Drake's Garden, Miss Nadia Rauji, who's with Uzenzele Holdings, as well as Mr. Gabriel Theron, who's with Silo Cyben. For each of my 4 panelists, before we even get into an interactive discussion on key questions around your different operations and the challenges and how you've dealt with them, I'm going to give you 2 minutes each just to give some introductory remarks. You can briefly touch on your organization, but more importantly, the issues that are relating to investment and financing that you've been grappling with, to then enable us to have a conversation there. Can I invite you, Pierre, to then take the floor? Mr. Kaba, can I request you to switch off your video just to assist us with the bandwidth quality? Thank you. Go ahead, Pierre.
Thank you, Dora, and thank you to the Gauteng government. It's an honor to be invited to talk at this kind of forum. We at Silverleaf, we launched our fund at the beginning of the year. We believe that cannabis will become an asset class that the investment managers cannot afford not to be part of. So we believe very firmly in the future prospects of the industry. But the challenge we faced is the investment community were very cynical. Now, there are a couple of reasons around that. There's been slow development in terms of the legislation framework. For example, hemp for CBD is an exciting sector we want to get involved in, but we've now been waiting for too long to get the regulations. We still don't know what the regulations are around hemp. And even around hemp, there's confusion, because some people think it's going to fall under SAPRA, other people think it's going to fall under DELRAD. So these are the issues. It's a difficult one. The other exciting or challenges in the industry is a lot of the investments they start up, the greenfields and brownfields. So that gives a fund manager quite a challenge, because in traditional venture capital investing, you tend to go for businesses that are slightly more established, but a lot of the businesses are still at early stages of development. When we built our team, we wanted to build a gap between the business community or the investment community and the industry. And they're 2 very different corporate cultures. So we were very specific that the first thing we needed to address were corporate governance issues. So we tied up with a company called GrowVest, and we invested a lot of time and effort into being a 12J fund, and we're now morphing into a full-blown VC. So corporate governance was very, very important for us. The other issue we tried to address was to build kind of support mechanisms for incubation. A lot of, as I mentioned, a lot of the businesses are early stage, so we're trying to get experienced executives who can help maybe the lesser experienced people with very good ideas. We did our first investment with Druids Garden. I won't talk much about that because Mr. Tonks is coming on and he's going to talk about Druids Garden, but that was in cultivation. We've recently had a roadshow. We received about 50 applications for funding. We saw 10 investment pitches last week, and we're going to now go into the next round of raising capital and investment. We believe this is an exciting industry with great growth prospects, and we believe South Africa is perfectly suited. So I'll just stop right there, but that's a little bit of an overview of where we come from as Silverleaf.
Wow, thank you very much here for that introduction. Can I then request Mr. Gavin Tonks, who is with Druids Garden? We are excited to just hear from you in terms of, I mean, I've just been reading through your profile here, the progress that you've done in a very short space of time with regards to even establishing a retail footprint on cannabis. Gavin, over to you.
Hi there, thank you, and thank you to all of those who've come in to listen to us today. I see there's over 450 people, which is really great. The first statement that I need to make is that it is not for the faint of heart. I haven't had so much stress in 20 years, I want to tell you, and I mean, I'm a mentor for small business. I've helped many businesses get past this point. The cannabis industry, the elephant in the room is that it is a drug. And as a drug, it's controlled by the Drug Act, and the banks see themselves exposed to being prosecuted for laundering drug funds and various other things. So they're all sitting on the fence and waiting on the sideline. And until such time as government steps in and clarifies, gazettes what they feel about cannabis, that situation is going to continue. So the financing is from angel investors, people like Pierre, who's believed in us right from the beginning. We've been going for 2.5 years now. We started with mushrooms and traditional medicine extracts under the indigenous knowledge systems. Our fellow directors are participants of the indigenous knowledge systems. So we knew that we were going to have issues with turnover. It takes 8 months to grow a crop. We have enormous challenges with the quality of the COAs. We've approached the CSIR to assist us. We sent the same oils to a number of different organizations. There was a 25% variance of what they said was in our oils. We then sent our oil to Holland. We were told in South Africa there's no zinc in our products. Holland said there was 0.001% zinc. So now the person doesn't want to purchase the crop because of the zinc inside the crop. I mean, for 3,500 years, people haven't cared about zinc in the crop. Now it's an issue. So there are enormous challenges that we face. All of the young people that want to join this industry, Kian and I, my fellow director, we spent a lot of time, almost 3 months, doing projections to say what happens if we had every single cent we needed to create this business, and we came to a figure of 76 million. So that is the pegged amount if you want to be serious. Plus we have challenges that when you look at the business, South Africa has a climate of sunshine. We want to grow outside, but government has chosen to follow the lead of Canada, who says we need to grow inside. So now we have these flippin' CEA controlled environmental agriculture projects with our cannabis sitting inside of them, dying of heat stroke, all of the other challenges that come with it, where we could grow easily outside. So it's hard out there, I want to tell you, it's really, really hard. So thank you so much for my 2 minutes. And if there's any questions, I'll be very grateful to answer.
Thank you, Gavin. I'm sure you will allow me to then add and say it's hard but not impossible. So
well, we're here.
Yes.
We're still here. 2.5 years later, we're fighting the fight. We're on this panel, so we're doing something right.
No, yes, definitely. All we need is passion and perseverance here. Then also let me move over to you, Ms. Nadia Rauji. I see that you've been doing a lot of work on really investment facilitation and financing packages around this particular space. just 2 minutes for you to really introduce yourself, and also I get a feeling you'll also say it's hard, but tell us how hard it is and how you navigate in the space. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, and great pleasure to be here. The journey in cannabis financing and corporate finance really started 2 years ago in 2019, when my business partner and I, Zara, decided to invest in the sector, and we went off to the United States and thought, sure, you know, it's an amazing sector, growth sector, things are moving really fast, and at that stage they really were. But came back into the South African and Lesotho environment and realized that the Canadians that had all come onto the continent to invest here had all burnt their fingers quite badly and had at that point started to run off. So yes, certainly I would say that, you know, our foray into the cannabis sector has been quite challenging, but coming from the perspective of working with the DFIs, the developmental finance institutions in the South African context for the past 10 years, the IDC, the DTI, we do believe that as the regulatory environment improves, as markets start to open, we're going to be seeing a lot of transacting taking place through the DFIs. You know, our other members have all said that one of the big challenges is where we look at sin sectors and understanding what is and what is not part of a sin sector for specific institutional funders like an IDC, like a DTI, become quite relevant. But I think it's also really important to look at the sector from an industrial perspective a little broader. Looking at, for example, the hemp sector, looking at the production and processing of hemp for end products that are not of medicinal and consumption basis, but for building materials, for other types of fiber usage, etc., where it's not consumption based, and using that as an entry point and a gateway to utilizing grants and incentives such as the Black Industrialist Scheme, which we heavily work on. That is our flagship product at Uzenzele. We help businesses access that capital, and I sit as the chairperson of the work group for business grants and incentives at the South African Institute of Taxation. And we're seeing that there's an increasing conversation around how to look at the sector through the grant funding that is available, looking at the agro-processing support scheme, co-funding with equity. And I think that's really important. I saw some questions about debt finance, and debt is really the most difficult type of finance to attract in the cannabis sector. It really is equity. It's investors that understand that this is a nascent industry, that markets aren't there, and that they're taking high risks for high prospective returns. And so where we look at equity funders that would like to blend their finance with grant funding at the DTIs, where I see a lot of opportunity. Currently, we're working with license holders out of Lesotho to capitalize their cultivation projects. And certainly COVID has been a massive stumbler with the inability of international funders being able to come into country for site visits, for GMP consultants to come in. So there have been additional restrictions and constraints that have been put onto projects. I think from a South African perspective, a Gauteng perspective, we're very fortunate to have the DFIs that are able to support the likes of Silverleaf. You know, it's Section 12J, and Section 12J can only be utilized for South African businesses. So, you know, there are a number of funds and structures and funding mechanisms that are available to South African projects that are not available for our counterparts on the continent. And I think it's really interesting to see that happen. We are seeing more investors coming in from other African countries where, as you know, large family offices and investment companies in other African countries where licensing hasn't been legislated as yet, they are looking for entry points in the likes of Lesotho and South Africa, and that's where we're seeing a fair amount of traction come in. That's where I will stop now and give our next speakers an opportunity.
Okay, thank you very much, Nadia. It's quite interesting, really, to hear and also saddening at the same time to hear that, you know, some other countries within the SADC region have moved a few notches ahead of us, but then also encouraging hear that, you know, the likes of the IDC and a number of institutions have been looking at this, and I do agree with you somewhat that, you know, debt financing, we still have a long way to go in terms of cannabis, especially in this time where, like Gavin said, where cannabis is still broadly considered as an illicit drug. Can I then, at this point, give over to Gabriel Theron to just give us also a few introductory remarks? Pierre, can I kindly request you to switch off your camera for a while? You'll switch it on again when you come on board, just to get a better bandwidth. Thank you. Gabriel, go ahead.
Many thanks, Chairperson, audience members, and then also Ms. Modise. I'm Johan Slabber. I'm Executive Director and Head of Business Development here at Psilocybin Pharmaceutical, and I will be representing Mr. Gabriel Theron today, who is then the Acting CEO of Psilocybin Pharmaceutical. Gabriel is a visionary entrepreneur that excels in startups and turnaround projects. And to give a bit of background, his career started as internal auditor at the SA Breweries, and then he co-founded an R&D company in the ICT sector. In 2015, he was appointed as non-executive board member at Safco, and then became second acting CEO in Safco. In 2018, Psilocybin was born. We acquired both a GACP and a GMP license, and we will be doing an IPO within the next couple of months, or we're planning on a deal listing and then an internal listing in Luxembourg or in Europe. We are the first company in SA then also to have acquired both licenses under one roof. As Kaisif indicated earlier on in the conversation, a GACP license limits you to your return on investment. So our approach involved extensive research, and we found that conforming to the requirements of regulatory authorities is just one step of the approach. But in order to drive a viable business and make great returns, you need to conform to the right standards. So many applicants in South Africa conform to the requirements of SAFRA and can now not drive a viable business today, as they do not meet the requirements of commercial markets. Very, very big difference there, and I want to emphasize meeting the requirements of regulatory authorities and having the right standards. Europe, for example, does not recognize our fixed GMP, and that comes with a lot of challenges on its own. So furthermore, you need to ensure that an agricultural plant-based product must conform on the requirements of general pharmaceuticals. So that's so difficult to do, to take an agricultural product and treat it as a normal pharmaceutical. So you need stability data, consistency in production, analytical testing, to mention a few. So we've signed offtake agreements with UK, Australia, Brazil, and countries in Europe. And the best way to unlock full potential of the cannabis industry is to set up to the highest standards and develop a facility or operation that does not limit you in terms of who you can supply, to make sure you get that return on investment and drive the economy and the opportunity that we have in the industry today in cannabis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I did catch that you are representing Gabriel, but I missed your first name.
Johan Slabber, yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Johan. It's interesting to know also that in less than 3 years, really you yourselves are a startup, but have given so much attention to these issues of capacitating the sector itself, which is very important if we are to grow in this particular space. Thank you, Johan. Can I then, and my panelists, please continue to have a look at the questions on the chat. I will not be able to read through all of them, but then let me go through a quick round of a discussion with some key questions that would give our audience a bit of insight into each of your spaces. Johan, can I request that you switch on your camera? You switch off your camera, please. For you, Pierre, being in investment at Silverleaf, and you have made a number of investments, starting now on cannabis, starting with the current one you've done with Drade's Garden, but even moving forward, given what we've heard this morning around the difficulties of growing in this particular sector in terms of capital intensity, legislative, really, let me not even call it gaps, immature legislative regime that is developing whilst we are developing the sector at the same time. And then also, given the fact that, you know, a number of speakers mentioned that, well, let's just make sure that there's a market out there. But then at the same time, it's difficult to go the full cycle of establishing a market until a number of steps are taken forward. So as an investor, Pierre, can you just share quick takeouts to our audience? We've got close to more than 450 people in this room, all of which I think are quite interested, and most of them currently looking for investors in this space. What would be the key issues that you would be looking for in order to take up any initiative and invest in it?
Thanks very much. Yeah, the key thing we look for is what is the market need and what is the solution, and how is your company going to address the market need, and then a breakdown and understanding of the market. There's the bigger market. We all know cannabis is worth $350 billion, but which part of the market are you addressing? And that's the addressable market. So we then look for a business plan that says this is the need, this is the solution, this is the addressable market, and this is how we're going to address the market. So we require business plans. We do understand that a lot of people are early in the revenue, and you touched on probably one of the really difficult areas, which is timing. At this point, we can only invest in medical SAPRO-approved cultivation Section 22 licenses. Hopefully the Drug and Drug Control Act will be changed, hemp will be opened up, then there's another sector. The key thing, and one of the challenges in the industry, is unless you have a fully developed value chain, it's quite difficult to get offtake agreements. For example, if hemp was legalized and we invested in hemp, the question is, where are the decortication factories? In cannabis, the question is, where are the extraction plants? So it's a bit of a complex environment. So timing is very critical. But the most important fact that we look at is the team. We look at the people, we try and evaluate the people, we try to get a rapport with the people. We try see whether there's good chemistry between our team and their team. We don't want to just bring money. We bring knowledge, we bring industry knowledge. So the most important thing is really the people. And at the end of the day, it's early industry. The leaders will get taken up by the market and growth in the market, but it's the ability to execute, which is probably the most important criteria that we look at.
Thank you very much for that criteria, Pierre. And given this criteria, let me move over to Gavin. Gavin, you as a trades garden, you've been focusing a lot on wellness, on health and wellness, and which would mean that even moving forward, a lot of the attention would be on the medicinal side and sort of like somehow moving more towards proper medicines. We did hear from, I think it was Kasib earlier on, who spoke about a need for integrated licenses, a need to make sure that if you are a particular operation, you are able to commoditize the entire plant and not just focus on a seed. The seed is important for certain uses, but the entire plant is quite important. So the industrial side as well. So I would like to hear from you as Trades Garden, that given where you've started now, do you really see maturation into the other spheres of cannabis? So let's look at hemp, for example, where it would have, I mean, the rest of the plant would have a significant benefits in terms of industrial users. So just share with us your thoughts around further expansion, but then also as you work towards market penetration, even on the current wellness products that we are working on, what are the issues that keep you awake at night in terms of that diversification, but then also, also your dreams for future expansion?
Okay, Dora, sorry, I have to laugh, but it's true. There's a lot that keeps us awake at night. We started 4 years ago with mushrooms. So we grew mushrooms, not psychotropic if everybody gets all excited about that, but the lion's mane, chaga, and various other mushrooms. And we started producing medicine from traditional plants. We do Artemisia tinctures and various things like that. And that has matured now. And then when we got our license and our permit to grow, we've introduced CBD products because they are legal in South Africa. So we have been working on wellness. It's our core focus in the business. It always has been. It's in our business plan. It's part of our vision and philosophy. What I've been experimenting with is ultrasound technology. So unfortunately, with an industry that's 3,500 years old, people turn around and say, oh, we've been extracting this way and we've been doing it that way. Well, you know, you've got to look at what's new. We have the technology to be able to put it onto a machine, go to a field, harvest off the field, to give the people back the dried plant, which they can then decortify and make cloth or whatever else they want, and we can walk away with the oils. One of the other problems is that a lot of the oils in South Africa are contaminated. They either have arsenic or they've got heavy metals. This technology can remove those during the processing plant so that we could have very, very high quality oils. And it also does the COAs based on the extraction. So we would have a strip which would tell us exactly what was in that oil at source. So there's a lot of complexity, you know, even in the 2.5 years that I've been working with the company, in terms of the COAs, what people want, the strengths, the THC, what constitutes a cure. We have to look at things that technically, look, I'm not an expert, but the way that I try and explain to people is to say that technically the cannabis works as a hormone. So once you use a hormone, it doesn't give even results. So you don't get the same result with each person, because each person has a genetic profile which is different. So that's one of the challenges that we have with medicinal cannabis, is that we can't take 10 people with the same problems and give them all the same product and have the same results. Like an anodin, for instance, you have a headache, you take an anodin, 99.99% of times you won't have the headache afterwards. It's not necessarily the same with cannabis. So the plant itself has many challenges, and every grow season that you've got a different oil, you've got a different quantity, you've got a different, more THC, less THC, and our sunlight creates THC. So we have taken genetics that should have no THC and it's grown THC. So yeah, there's a lot of challenges that we need to deal with. In terms of government support, we do need that. In terms of the vision, I would like to focus as my team on South Africa. I feel that our medicine is very high quality. We are known in the marketplace for the quality of our medicine. And I would like to see it available for South Africans. I would like to see our medicine in hospitals. We have 500,000 people with epilepsy. It was mentioned in the beginning as one of the things. Imagine we can supply a product that would cost 500 Rand a month to help people prevent seizures. You know, that's where the money is. That's where the business actually is. We chase these dreams of supplying Germany and Canada and everybody. That's not our core market. Our core market is South Africans. Let's get government to change that landscape. The other thing that I'd love to do is that the Constitutional Court requires that people have the right to access cannabis. I would like to be able to take our landrace genetics. We have fantastic South African genetics. We can't register them because DARAB doesn't allow us to, because it's a scheduled substance. To be able to register those genetics, to be able to grow plantlets, to sell it at plant park and things that people can have their own little plants at home, I think that would be a game changer if you ask me what I want in the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Gavin. I've also just read a very interesting but sad question on the chat, and I'm going to even challenge Nadia to delve on that, and it's also linked to that further growth, given that you just spoke about, and the need for, the whole, diversifying and really in earnest growing as an industrial sector in your own right. Earlier on, also during the scene setting sessions, we've had talks on the issue of, licensing. We do know that we've got a handful of license holders on the medicinal side. We do know that there is hard work going on at the national government, which is looking at ensuring that the licensing regime becomes easier. And also there's a lot of concerns on the chat about decriminalization. And I know that there's a lot of work that is currently underway on that. And a lot of us, really you and I, hope that the process will move as fast as possible. I also heard earlier on, I think it was Ayanda, saying that actually about 1% of ventures end up getting financing for whatever they are asking for. And here on the chat, someone then raised a question. I caught a name, it was Edgar, who was then saying, but we need to address issues around entry financing. So there's a lot of barriers around entry financing, and he mentioned, he or she, apologies, mentioned that you would need, for example, about 2.5 million to get a license, first and foremost, to get to a point of receiving a license. So which already cuts off a lot of our emerging farmers. So there's probably a lot of those farmers in this platform today saying, I want to go in for cannabis. And we did also hear that the number of farmers, I think it was in the US, started just planting, and suddenly you remove your vegetable crops and you lay out your 8-hectare land with cannabis plants, hoping that you will find an off-taker later on, and at the end of the day, there's nothing that happens. So from your side as Uzenzele, Nadia, but then also your experience as well in terms of working in the whole investment financing and transactioning, and having looked at a number of transactions around cannabis, would you really say that there are real financial barriers to entry? And what are those barriers? And how can we, from investment and financing facilitation, try to unlock that or create a bit of an eased access to most of those who are interested in entering the space? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam DDG. So where we look at finance in general, Yanda spoke about the 1% that actually attracts finance. That's quite standard in most sectors. So when we talk to the likes of an IDC, of the 100 applications the IDC receives, only 4% actually get to due diligence, never mind getting through due diligence and in front of credit committee. And the reasons for that are bankability, which Ayanda also spoke about, access to markets, permitting, licensing. So in this sector, what we see is certainly from a licensing perspective, looking at it at 2.5 million just for the license is significant, but it's not just the 2.5 million for licensing. You also need to accommodate for additional project preparation to actually access markets, to engage, to have the right quality of individuals engaging with prospective off-takers and funders. And then it's, the bill just starts racking up. And we do find, therefore, that a lot of the individuals and businesses who participate in the sector come from some generation of wealth over 1 or 2 generations, and they've got their own money that they can actually put behind the licensing. So yes, it's a major challenge. I think what needs to happen is an approach of saying, well, we know that there's a specific sector and industry that has certain replicable licensing requirements. So when I say replicable, in order to submit your license, there are certain documents, supporting documents, etc., that are standard. And how do we as government, how do we as private sector work together to establish some sort of a portal, some sort of a framework where what is standardized can be provided, and then what needs to be customized can be customized. where at the moment everyone is starting from step one and having to do everything in a customized fashion. So collaboration within sector is critical. And similarly with off-takers, how do we get off-takers into rooms? How do we get engagement with the off-takers in international markets? But I think so importantly, is the domestic market. If we don't get the domestic market right, it doesn't make sense for a farmer to convert their farms into hemp or marijuana cannabis grow. It simply does. There's nowhere to take that product at the moment, and we do need to focus on getting our domestic markets right. And I'll give you a story of one of our colleagues out of Detroit, and what they had done is they had first gone into the retail dispensary model. And they come out of process engineering as a business. So they've made good money as process engineers, identified this opportunity in cannabis, invested into a dispensary license and set up that business and started to understand the market dynamics, the demands of the market, etc. And eventually they sold out of that business and got out of dispensary and backward integrated into cultivation at a high-tech level. But they already knew the product. They already knew what the market needed. And I think that we could talk about regulation as an umbrella conversation, but really regulation from a market perspective and knowledge of patients and distribution channels, market value chains are what are so critical in South Africa. And probably the easiest way to start it is to allow for some level of import of product. And I am an economist, a development economist, and my day-to-day is in industrial development. So I don't say it for us not to have a local industrial base, but in order to test the markets and understand what the South African consumer wants, we need to open up the ability to test with other end products and have the retail component and the doctors resolved so that patients can get to their products. And that's so critical. Once patients and consumers are able to obtain product, to then backward integrate and have the relevant industrial development and cultivation in country makes a lot more sense and provides funders the comfort that they are funding a business that can generate income, and by generating income can repay the capital that has been deployed. So yes, it is extremely sad that the reality currently is that if you don't have, and I would say that 2.5 million is really a conservative budget to have in mind. If you don't have a good 10 to 20 million rand between yourselves and those around you as consortium, you're going to find it quite difficult to start if you want to get to a GMP export ready type market, and that 10 to 20 might come in the form of advisors, might come in the form of partners that bring in kind contributions to your project. But you still need that expertise, because in order to attract the buyers and the off-takers in global markets, which are frankly the only real global markets, the only markets we see currently that are of any value, it's really challenging. We talk about Israel only taking 17 tons in an entire year. 17 tons of any product is such a small volume of product that it doesn't justify large investments at this stage. So the market really needs to catch up. And for me, whilst we can talk about regulation from a licensing perspective for cultivation and industrialization, I would like to see more done around the licensing and regulation from a market and trade perspective, so that we can really understand what it is that the market wants and then work backward from there.
Thank you very much for that, Nadia. Really food for thought, ensuring that we understand what the market wants. and ensuring that we understand our product as well as producers and as extractors, and therefore being able to put a convincing business case on the table. I'm going to come to you. We are at Silo 7. I'm trying to see if I'm pronouncing it correctly. But you know, before I do that, I read a couple of depressing notes on the chat. Elisha and Tepo, if you start by saying that it's impossible for you as upcoming young farmers to succeed in the space, then it will definitely be impossible. I think what we've accepted is that it is hard, and different speakers have really given their pointers in terms of where the difficulties are, but there would be ways of overcoming such difficulties. And I also see a number of questions on what is government doing to support the upcoming disadvantaged farmers, to support the young people. Yes, that support would be upcoming, especially for disadvantaged young new entrants. And this particular even webinar and the series of conversations we are having is such that we also as government can be better informed in terms of how do we support, at what point do we enter, and at what point do we push, because at the end of the day, you also do not want to see government investing in ventures that would not be able to proceed. So we wouldn't even wish to set anyone up for failure. We ourselves are in a learning process with yourselves. And which is why now we applaud the initiatives that Gabriel is running there at Silo Cabin. And Uno will just share with us in terms of how they are engaging with really newcomers, the guys that really do not have much information, do not have much background, but are saying, but I have the passion, this is something I would like to enter into. And how you are really approaching that particular part, just to assist those who are similar to Elisha and Tepo that are already giving up given the interventions in this webinar. Go ahead.
Many thanks, DDG. Yeah, so just to come back, one of the biggest problems that we face currently in this industry is the regulatory challenges. It is so difficult. When we started in 2018 with the approach, we thought it's as easy as getting a license through SAFRA and start exporting your products. We brought them to an empty building, not knowing that there's all these documents and processes and everything that you need to have in place prior to them doing an inspection and giving you a license. We've went through the process. You do need a lot of capital upfront to get to the licensing point, which is more a license-ready approach. And then to go production ready, you'll need additional capital. The cannabis industry is one of the biggest markets one of the markets with the highest OPEX, when looking at it in terms of the business side. And it took us about 2-3 years to get to the point where we realized that after doing a lot of research, we need to go to the GMP route in order to export and have a viable business. But the process that we need to come back to and understand is that SAFRA, the regulatory authority in South Africa, needs to regulate the product, and it has been classified and specified as Schedule 4 for CBD and Schedule 6 for THC. So in order for us to drive a successful business, we have to look at where the opportunity currently lies for South Africans and the SA industry in terms of this market. And that is at this stage commercial, because low cost production, that is the opportunity that we have here. We can produce in low cost and we can receive currency and buyers and get paid in dollars and euros and pounds. But to be able to get to that point, you need to have certain standards in place. And the standards is very stringent. If you are not from a pharmaceutical background, to get the approach right is almost impossible. And I do agree with the challenges and the comments that was made. But once you get through this process, it's really a lot easier to set up going forward. So one thing that we found is that if you implement from the start the right standards in your approach that you take with the cannabis approach, that standards unlocks potential markets when you conform to their standards. And those markets and access to those markets in the forms of offtake agreements, etc., will then help to unlock investment in the industry. And that investment will then help us to capitalize as South Africans on the opportunity at hand. But having said that, the position that we are in now, also having obtained our GMP license that helps us to now process and extract cannabis and cannabis-derived products, it still limits us in terms of gaining access to the local market, which is a challenge we feel should not be that. For example, currently, when a patient would like to have cannabis or needs access to cannabis for pain or inflammation, whatever it might be, acute or chronic disease, a doctor needs to motivate through Section 21 and import an unregistered medicine, which would normally be seen as unregistered medicine, let me say that, to this country and motivate to SAFRA why this patient needs it, and then get this product from other countries into South Africa. Whereas we are now a manufacturer, for example, in South Africa, we could supply that product, have it analytically tested, and that patient would know what he's getting, and we can conform to the requirements of the doctors and SAFRA. But that can't happen, and we're blocking the local market, and that's a big challenge. So for the short term, we have to go commercial, you have to export to get income, but for the long term, we need to look at the beneficiation of South Africa and how we can capitalize on this opportunity here locally. And having said that, we don't need to continue to apply for GACP licenses, which allows you to cultivate and export bulk packaged flower. Why don't more people that can cultivate already produce products to manufacturers to extract them and then export those products to create a local chain that can be used to capitalize on in that sense, you know? Not otherwise, everyone will end up going to the higher standards, invest all this capital, and everyone is competing, you know, for commercial markets. There will also only be so many buyers. And the only reason why it's really a great opportunity for us now is really the cost of production. If we can't produce to a lower cost than commercial markets can or other countries can, then we will not be able to supply into certain avenues. We have also used cannabis in a sense from a funding and financing perspective, and the hype of cannabis and the industry to help fund the rest of the developments and company processes that we are currently tackling, and which is mushrooms or psilocybin and the rest of the technology and everything else that we're developing. But yeah, it is not easy to get into, but we need to understand and give SAFRA some accreditation as well that they need to set the standards right, because we're not only looking at beneficiating and contributing to the local markets, but we also need to look at the requirements of commercial markets. So to conclude, I would like to leave everyone with the message of conforming to the requirements of SAFRA is one step of the process, but to implement the right standards is a completely different game to ensure viable business and exports. Thank you, DDG.
Thank you very much, really, for that input. Can I then request Mr. Isaacs Kasif, because we are also in investment management, just to also add on to this particular conversation on investment, on cannabis operations, and how you as an investment manager would really approach any application that comes through, but then also, because I had also seen your hand was up, to add on to any of the comments that were made by the panel members. You know, after you, I will also go to the other plenary speakers on a number of questions that are on a chat, including there were questions on seeds, which seeds can we buy and which ones can we not buy, versatility of hemp and all that, and there's a number of criticisms around government, which we are noting as well as provincial government. Kasif, would you like to then add your weight a bit on the investment question?
Thanks, Modise. I want to start by saying that we must learn from our colleagues in the technology space and segment this developing market. And what I mean by that is we need to develop an incubation model and framework and all the support structures to bring the emerging farmers through a process, and then have the investors that focus on more mature products or more mature businesses come in later. We need that support of angel investors, family officers, and much like our tech colleagues, actually foster incubation hubs that will allow the early stage and emerging participants in the market to access support, capital, and knowledge to help them establish their businesses. If from our perspective as an institutional investor, our mandates are restricted. We are not a venture capital fund. So we are going to look for businesses with some form of track record, tangible engagement with off-takers, very strong team, both on the technical side in terms of understanding the product, and then also the cultivation itself, as well as the processing. So it's that blend of industrial and agricultural skills and pharmaceutical. I think that's central to us to say that this particular opportunity has a chance of success, alongside the ability to market the product. So for me, that framework and rolling that out quickly is key. Otherwise, as much as South Africa is now opening up, we have to realize that there are other markets, including Lesotho, where they've been through the pains, and we are lagging in terms of really achieving scale in the space. But we can't leave our emerging industrialists and farmers behind. So, but coming back to your question on what we look at, I think the components around the strength of the team, which the Silverleaf speaker spoke to, is critical. Some form of track record, having at least gone through 1 or 2 cycles of actual cultivation, small volumes of offtake in the market. That's our entry point in reality, and that to get there is going to take several million rand. Depending on your ambitions in terms of size, it could be hundreds of millions of rands. So getting that early investor excited, getting them to come in and take that early stage risk, and that is dependent on that incubation program being there and bringing through bankable businesses. Thanks, Mayor. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for that. And yes, bankability of any kind of business remains a key issue, whilst we are recognizing the fact that, especially for us in agriculture, there's a lot of startups and emerging that would need support from our side, really, as government, to get them to a point where organizations such as yourselves and even at some point we will definitely get to a point where commercial banks also start looking at this particular space. But then we know that commercial banks will in most instances be guided by a more stable regulatory framework. So hopefully within the next 12 months or so we would be at that point of regulatory certainty. Sbusiso, let me throw this over to you before I also go back to Ayanda a bit. And I do see that we have to wrap up. I was also conscious that the first session took more time, so I'm giving it a few more minutes, but we will be closing. I'll just give each member 30 seconds to close up. But Sbusiso, for you, maybe touch a bit on really, you have dealt with issues of investment and you've spoken to those issues. I also see, even from the questions on the chat, there are issues on, but which seed or which plant can I go for? We do use cannabis as a family name, and there's a number of species, and in most instances, depending on the THC content, one would be allowed to do something with it and others not. And there's still this interest around the recreational use of that. Just maybe a few words from your side in terms of what's allowed and what's not allowed, and what you feel are future prospects in about a minute, Sibusiso. Thank you.
Sure. So what I would say is that the cannabis industry in South Africa is really made up of two verticals currently, which is medical cannabis for export only. There, the objective is usually actually to grow high THC or blended cannabis strains. In other words, you're looking for cannabis that has quite a high international market demand in terms of the international medical cannabis landscape. Now, to the point of many of the speakers earlier, that is an extremely regulated and capital-intensive area to play into, where millions of rands are required to get off the ground. The other opportunity is really in the industrial hemp space, and that is generally low THC strains that require much less sort of regulatory oversight. And South Africa is only just stepping into that realm in terms of the Department of Agriculture beginning to issue hemp beginning to accept applications for hemp permits from next month. But really, I think it's going to be sort of early next year when we start to see those permits being approved. And so those are the two main areas of opportunities in terms of profiles and sort of strains. And that's just, I guess, a quick overview and summary of that.
Okay, thank you very much. Before I move over to you, Ayanda, for a few words, let me, because I also see there's quite a number of issues around the license and SAPRA. We did say the previous webinar focused on these regulatory frameworks, and there is already work at advanced stages where there is a transfer in terms of the licensing of hemp from SAPRA to Department of Agriculture. And that is hemp, not the marijuana part, not the medicinal part. So that should actually be concluded quite soon, and the applications would go through the Department of Agriculture for those particular licenses. Can I then ask you, Ayanda, given what you've shared before and what you've heard from our panelists and in your point in terms of investment readiness and how enterprises can be ready, and we've also seen on the chat quite a number of participants are saying, but how do I start, and will I get an investment, and at what point, and all that. Just a few take-homes you'd like to share to our participants?
First of all, certainly do take the opportunity to contact me if you would like to go through some questions around the process, whether that's around doing your feasibility assessment or thinking about the licensing process. But just something related to what my colleague Sibs mentioned earlier. I think the recognition here is that we don't yet have a commodity market. So it's not like you just go and grow a bunch of stuff and then somebody eventually buys them. So usually when you think about genetics are, you pick the genetics for the specific kind of result that you want the plant to give you. So whether that's like a phenotypical or a genetic characteristic, usually off-takers will be quite specific around what they're looking for, and so you're a lot guided by that. So remember, this is a market that's based on like exchange by private treaty, not based on commodities. So just some free advice there for those folks. The seed side is a little bit of a challenge at the moment because of course it's still illegal based on the Drugs Act. And I think one of the things maybe is to say we recommend that people engage with their constituents and their representatives in various fora around some of these challenges. The biggest burden that has been explained here, and I think it relates to our previous point, and I'm sorry for taking a little extra time, but given that I also now serve on the National Master Plan Committee and sort of starting to understand how some of these issues get brought up to the fore, the critical thing for us is around how do all the various parties within the industry actually coalesce around the regulatory burdens. The principal one being the Drugs Act. which basically has major implications, whether it's on financing the liberalization of hemp, because even with the permitting regulations being enabled next month, under the Drugs Act, you still have hemp that is illegal. So it does present quite a number of challenges around sort of getting, especially on the financing side, because if you can't raise financing for some of these markets, the private markets, then there's a huge burden that's also placed on the national fiscus to be able to finance a number of these elements. So if there's anywhere to really focus, it's around let's prioritize getting over some of these regulatory burdens. We also appreciate that there's quite a requirement around sort of support on processing. There are a number of outfits available, including B-Cubed, that supports businesses with this stuff every single day. So please do reach out on that. But I think it's in terms of how Dr. Dar, from the provincial perspective, takes us forward, I think the regulatory enabling is actually something that you might find also helps to catalyze a lot more investment activity in the industry.
Yes, thank you very much for that, Ayanda. Can I then request from my panelists also a minute each just to round off your contribution and the discussion for today? I'll start with you, Pierre. If you are speaking, Pierre, I think your mic is muted.
Yeah, I'm there. Okay, just to summarize, I think there are a lot of opportunities in the industry. The barriers are high for medical, but there are a lot of other opportunities, and I think we should focus on these opportunities. My view is we need to design an industry starting with the small farmers, build the industry from the bottom. There's space for everybody. There's space for small businesses. There's space for big businesses. We're not all competing for the same market. And essentially, when hemp comes online, we're looking at one of the biggest industries in the world. We have an opportunity to design a very specific industry in our country, and I think we should do that. We shouldn't wait for guidance from international companies. And again, I say start at the bottom, start with the small farmers and build the industry upwards. If we don't build the value chain and beneficiate, we're going to lose out on opportunities. I don't agree with importing goods, or we need to process in our own country. The licensing issues need to be opened up, and we need to move quickly as a government, because if we don't do this, other countries are going to steal our lunch. So we at Silverleaf remain very positive about this industry and believe it is a positive sector and one that will deliver exceptional returns for investors. We need to stop arrests and stop carrying on with this illegal drug mentality. A lot of the myths have been disproved. So we remain very optimistic about the industry. I'll drop contact details. If people are looking for investment, they're welcome to get hold of us. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you so much. I think that is music to many of our ears to say that we can get hold of you. We will also make sure that we make contact details available. Obviously, we'll make sure that all our speakers today consent that we share their contact details, and we'll make sure that they are available on all our platforms. And just a request to our communicators that when you do post, do tag these different organizations that are with us, such that our participants are able to even follow and go onto their page, social media pages or their websites for more information. Gavin, a few closing remarks from your side?
Yeah, one of the things, reading the comments from these young farmers who want to give up before they start, you know, that's very, very disappointing for me. If we had said that in the beginning when we started, and even now with the challenges that we face, we wouldn't be where we are. So for those guys, they can approach the DTI. They've got a section there that does co-ops. One single small farmer might not make it, but 10 or 20 small farmers as a co-op could. So there are opportunities like that. People don't have to grow. They can go to our website. They can register as a wholesaler. They can start selling the products to generate money, to then forward their own career. There's the Tree of Life franchise. We've made it very, very cheap for people to access it, to sell the wellness products. There are 5 stores up and running already across the country: Cape Town, Durban, Pretoria, and Johannesburg. So there's a lot of opportunity for people, and it doesn't always have to be just about growing. You can make, you can bake, you can shake, you can do whatever you want, but get into the industry and make it work, make it financially viable.
Great, thank you very much for those words, Gavin. You know, you've read my mind. Pierre, if you can switch off your camera, please. We wouldn't like to see what we are not supposed to be seeing. Nadia, a few words from your side.
Thank you, Madam DDG. So from my side, really, it is to say that we need to develop markets, and the way to develop markets is through the domestic regulation around distribution and consumption, as well as the trade regulations for export and import. And I do find that the reality is that in order to understand a market, use the benefits of other markets first. There are other investors in other countries that have invested into cultivation and extraction. Bring in the product, learn the product, and then backward integrate yourself. Look at obtaining licenses where you can get access to their products with the option to manufacture or cultivate on their behalf for the African continent and for the SADC region. And think of things like the African Free Trade Agreement. This is a long-term game. Cannabis is not a short-term game. So you need to think of this not only for the exporting of products in the current format to international markets, but how does this become a 20, 30, 50-year business? This is not about a quick shot in and out. It's not a spontaneous knee-jerk. This is a business that needs a lot of attention, and I just think that that's something a lot of businesses need to think of. And in that, really, I do believe that the regulatory environment is going to come to a point soon where, at the very least, structured finance through equity and grant funding through the DTI will be obtainable. I think that grant funding through various provincial governments can be made available, and the debt funders will then follow suit in the next few years. I think what is important, and for everyone to get a bit of an understanding, is that these are not challenges that only South Africa faces. These are international challenges. These are challenges in the United States, which has the largest consumer market at the moment of cannabis. The nascency and the unstructured fashion of markets and distribution channels, the pushback from the financial sector because of international regulatory environments. So these are not things that are unique, but we need to move fast as South Africa so that we can capture the African market once the African Free Trade Agreement comes into place, and that we can be leaders. And we are very, very fortunate to have one of the largest domestic markets on the continent, and we need to make use of that. So those are my closing remarks, Madam DDG, and thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Nadia. Was it Uno? Uen from Silo Simon? Do you have any closing remarks? Sorry if I butchered your name.
No worries, Madam DDG. Thank you so much for the program director. Thank you for my fellow colleagues on the panel today, and Madam DDG for yourself as well. I would just like to close off by saying that we have been through the challenges ourselves as psilocybin pharmaceutical. We obtained our cultivation license, we obtained our manufacturing license, which is yet again a first in SA to have both under one roof. We've got an extremely well or big global reach and a lot of global support in everything that we are doing. So to everyone out there, you're more than welcome to reach out to us for any assistance or guidance on this approach. And also what we are doing and the South African government is doing to help and sustain this economy is really fantastic. And we need to work together to make this work. Thank you very much to all.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We thank you very much to our panel and speakers. But before I hand over to the HOD for Economic Development for closing, I would just like to say, based on also some other questions directed to government, that firstly, and I saw someone really screaming there to say, why are you not answering the right questions, and sugar and what was it, nicotine or cigarettes are legal and so on and so forth. Well, firstly, there is a process underway. The difficult part about cannabis, like I've said, is that different species would look the same, whilst one would have 0.5% THC content and the other one will have 25%. And normally, if I'm correct, SAPRA looks at, and I think by law, it has to be below 5%. But most of the, what you would call marijuana, will be way past the 5%, which is why it would have that whole hazy feel to it. So you would then appreciate that having to legalize this particular crop would require key considerations in terms of up to what point, and how do you then make sure that you don't get the illicit and wrongful use. And also, I think Ayanda mentioned earlier on that even in countries where cannabis is legal, the black market is still very much driving most of the sales and therefore killing them more of your mainstream market. So it's not something that you can just wake up tomorrow and then say everything is legal. There's quite a number of considerations that needs to be taken into place. And that being said, for Gauteng Province, cannabis is one of the 10 key high growth sectors that the Premier has pronounced on, and is a priority issue. And the HOD earlier on spoke to those matters, as well as the MEC, who was then represented by the chair of board for the Innovation Hub. So what we are then now saying is that it is a priority. We are doing something about it. And yes, someone was asking, can we have mentorship and so forth? We have made a clear decision that we are starting with development of 2 cannabis hubs, one in the Vaal and one is in the West Rand. And these particular hubs will take a model where we bring in some startups. So there will be some incubation model that is linked to that, wherein we make sure that those that are starting up also get the support they are needed in order to succeed. And hopefully those hubs will then give birth to further hubs throughout the province, and would be able to see a sector that is thriving. Really rest assured that it's a priority of the Premier. It's also the priority of the MEC for us to grow this, and more especially industrial cannabis. So far, most attention has been on medicinal cannabis. So thank you very much for embracing me. I'm now going to hand over to HOD Mr. Blake Lefatola for him to give us his closing remarks and vote of thanks. HOD, over to you.
Good afternoon, Chairperson, together with the other colleagues on the call and the participants at large. My responsibility is just to provide a couple of closing remarks, and then also to pass a vote of thanks. I must indicate that the session as this webinar has been very, very interesting and lively, and if it is that we just go by the numbers, then it has been exceptionally successful, because at one stage I saw that there were about 471 people participating in this webinar. So that just gives you a sense of the interest that it has actually generated. And also, if you look at the chat box, it also gives an indication of how lively the session actually was, and the interest that it has actually stirred, and the questions that people were asked. It was quite clear that people are pretty much interested and wanted to know more about this particular industry that is fairly new, that some speakers have actually indicated, is a fairly new industry and sector of our economy. So, ladies and gentlemen, just to pull things together in terms of, the closing remarks, what are the, takeaways? There's about 5 points that I want to make before I actually do the vote of thanks. The first point is that, this cannabis webinar just reinforces, the point that the cannabis sector is one of the 10 high growth sectors that has been identified by the Premier and provincial government for particular attention to create jobs and to grow the economy. The particular interest that we have as provincial government is to ensure the industrialization, and agro-processing potential of this, cannabis industry, and that we actually need to unlock it and use it for medicinal purposes, for healthcare and skincare, amongst other users. But we've also indicated, and we've taken a conscious decision as provincial government, that the work around exploiting the economic opportunities and the economic potential that this particular sector brings cannot be done by ourselves and on our own. We need to form partnerships, particularly with the private sector, some development finance institutions, your venture capital, institutions, the other stakeholders that are there within the sector, the regulatory authorities that are also playing within, the space, and the actual actors, and farmers and entrepreneurs that are playing within, the space. We need to form that partnership so that we can jointly work together and deal with whatever bottlenecks that are actually there to ensure that people are becoming successful entrepreneurs within this particular space and grow the economy and create jobs, because the unemployment rate that we actually have within the province is frightening, to say the least. The 35.4% unemployment that we have is something that we can't really tolerate. And also given the fact that of that number of people actually unemployed, women, the percentage of women and the youth, would stand much higher than the 35.4%. Women would be about 60%, of the 35.4% that I'm quoting. And youth would be in the region of about 46%. So clearly it's a dire situation that we have, and we need to embrace with all energy and commitment the opportunities that can be exploited in this particular sector to create jobs. So that's the first point that I want to make. The second point that I want to make is that also we've heard from the speakers, from the variety of speakers that we've had, about the fact that some are estimating that the cannabis industry can be worth 27 billion by 2023. But there are other experts who says that if you look at the entire value chain, of this particular industry, you can basically unlock about 107 billion, from this industry by 1, regulating, 2, cultivating, 3, manufacturing, and 4, the sale of cannabis, products. That is if we are to exploit, the full, value chain. So that just gives you a sense of the rent worth value of this particular sector that can be exploited. The third point that I would like to make and take away is that in order for us to exploit this particular sector, the provincial strategy for cannabis industrialization needs to be completed like yesterday. And we know that our sister department, GDAT, is leading this process, and very soon they will be in a position to share, with the public at large and other players at large, what this provincial strategy for cannabis industrialization is going to be looking like, how it's going to be forming, partnerships, how it's going to try and deal with the challenges of investment in the sector that has been highlighted by some of the speakers, how it's going to try and deal with issues around incentives and grants, for startups, within this particular industry. And these were some of the major comments that were made in the chat box that I came across as I just scrolled through the comments that people were actually making. And part and parcel of that will also include what the DDG earlier indicated, that it's going to be as a province, we are interested in establishing 2 industrial hubs as a kickstart of intervention in the space, and which are to be concentrated, both hubs are to be concentrated in the south, Seribeng, and the other one, in the West Rand. And that's a project that is actually being led by GDAT. And that project is also being driven from the war room that the 2 departments, GDAT and DED, have actually established. And the war room's responsibility essentially is to expedite implementation of economic development projects that can result actually in job creation and growing the economy. The last point basically relates to the fact that we would want to ensure that the focus on growing the cannabis industry should lead to inclusivity. Black industrialists must play a major part within this particular sector. The focus on enterprise development and supplier development must actually seek to bring the majority of excluded people from the mainstream economy into the fold. Focus on Black, particularly the youth, and particularly, female, in this particular area, so that we try and build a sector that is actually inclusive, a sector whose ownership is actually inclusive of the people of the country, and does not exclude, the majority of the people of the country, as the current, mainstream economy actually does. So our work is actually cut out as a provincial government, but we believe that with the active support and participation, of the private sector and all other stakeholders, this can actually be an exciting journey, for us moving forward. And the last point is just to thank, the people who actually made this event a success. Our co-host, Department of Agriculture, and particularly Tilly there, the HOD for the department, big ups to you and your team for pulling this off and ensuring this webinar is a success that it has actually been. Let's also thank the speakers, Dr. Rajitanga, who actually stood in for the MEC, and the speakers in the plenary, and also, the panelists who also shared with us their experiences. I must indicate that having listened to Ayanda's story, as an entrepreneur that basically set up and walked the talk in terms of, being a successful entrepreneur within the cannabis, sector, was really fascinating. And I'm sure that we will actually want to touch base with you later on, just to tap into your, wealth of wisdom, and likewise so too with the other, panelists and the speakers. We would want to continue to rely on your support and information and knowledge as we seek to contribute building this particular, industry. And then lastly, just to indicate that program director, I actually think that you did a sterling job, and big ups to you also. But most importantly, let's not forget the participants, the 471 or more participants that participated in this webinar and who were present, since the morning up to now when we actually close. Thank you very much for your participation, for your number one, your attendance and the participation and the questions that you actually asked. I think that the questions that you actually asked, I'm sure my fellow HOD Tilly will agree that there's a lot of work that we need to do as government in terms of providing the necessary, infrastructure and setup, to respond to the small budding entrepreneurs that would seek assistance and ask questions about how do you set up and go about becoming successful if you want to be a successful entrepreneur in the cannabis, sector. So with those, few words, thank you very much, and the webinar is closed. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, HOD, and thank you very much to all participants. Thank you.